Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10th Annual Building Resilience Through Private-Public Partnerships Conference. I'm Mark DeCourcy, the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and I lead the Chamber's Corporate Citizenship Center. In times of disaster, it takes all sectors coming together to drive meaningful change. And never has that been more apparent than during the COVID-19 crisis. The events of the past year have sparked unprecedented collaboration across private, public, and the nonprofit sectors. I'll share a recent example. From the very beginning of COVID, the Chamber Foundation has been tracking how companies and their partners have responded to the pandemic and how they've supported communities, not just here in the US, but around the world as well. In May, the Chamber helped lead the launch of the Global Task Force on Pandemic Response to provide a unified platform for businesses to mobilize and deliver resources to assist COVID-19 efforts in areas of the highest need around the world. Over 40 global companies answered this call. We knew that India was facing a dire healthcare crisis from a rapid rise in COVID-19 cases. So in partnership with the Chamber's US-India Business Council, the Business Roundtable, and the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, the Global Task Force took immediate actions to help address the surge in India, including purchasing and delivering 1,000 Medtronic ICU ventilators. These vents will not only save lives during this wave of COVID or even the next, but will be there helping India's most vulnerable for years to come. The Chamber Foundation also created an information sharing portal for US businesses to post offers of essential in-kind products and services needed by the government of India. And this week, we opened it up for Indonesia. For these overseas crises, we've granted USAID 24/7 visibility into our platform, so they can better inform us from the government perspective, and we them. Our plan is to keep this site active for catastrophic events, whether here or around the world. These are just yet more examples of the power and the promise of private-public partnerships. While there is great need abroad, COVID-19 has exposed deep-rooted vulnerabilities within US communities as well. And we've seen the virus has impacted every corner of this country, and recovery has not yet been achieved. Today, we'll examine the past, present, and future of the COVID crisis, as well as natural disasters, to better understand our new normal and what we can learn from this moment, and how we, as individuals, organizations, and communities, can work together to build a more resilient future that drives opportunity, prosperity, security, and most importantly, equitable advancement for all. I'd like to thank DHS, FEMA, and Northcom for their support in helping us bring you these important conversations. This event would also not be possible without our SHAPE leaders and sponsors. They support our disaster preparedness, response, and recovery work at the Chamber Foundation. And before we start, I'd also like to remind you that during our sessions, you can submit questions and comments using our chat box feature. It's hard to believe we've been hosting this conference for 10 years with our federal partners. I remember when it was just a spark of an idea that we discussed around a conference table at Red Cross headquarters. We've come a long way from then, where we just had a few hundred the first year. This year, we're up to 1,500 people who have registered for this event. But we still have much work to do. And fortunately, the right partners to do it with, which includes all of you. With that, I'd like to pass it over to our longtime partner and friend, Rob Glenn. Rob is the Director of the Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration at FEMA. Rob, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Mark, for that kind introduction and for all the work that the Chamber Foundation has done with partnership in mind. And certainly that's reflective of the number of people that have registered for this year's conference. It's a pleasure to join all of you in this 10th annual conference devoted to the movement of bringing industry and government closer together to build readiness and resilience, confronting the shared societal risks that we all face. Mark highlighted some of the accomplishments of the Chamber working together with not just the US government, but internationally as well to meet the needs of COVID-19. When this conference started 10 years ago, we were just beginning to, as Mark shared, very informally about what is the whole community? How do we bring different stakeholders together from a disaster context? And since then, we've seen a whole nation rising in response and still ongoing to COVID-19. The work done in this conference and in the intervening years has helped create capacity and capability, achieving more unity of effort before, during, and after disasters, crises, and disruption. Now, there's many of different ways of defining these events, and that's something to take note of in this year's conference. There's no shortage of challenge. It's not just the global pandemic. It's the fact that in 2020, the hurricane season was perhaps the most active ever, with 13 of 30 named tropical storms considered hurricanes. This year's forecast looks to be above average in terms of frequency, if not outright intensity. At FEMA, we had the National Response Coordination Center activated for a record 461 days for COVID-19 response, as well as hurricanes and wildfires requiring operational coordination and resources from across the US government in partnership with many of you and certainly across the country. This means the National BEOC that I'm fortunate enough to lead actively worked more than 13,000 separate issues over this time. Everything spanning information sharing requirements, resources, information updates, GIS products, and just really helping industry navigate the complexity of this time. This opportunity we have is to share not just lessons learned, but to apply them. And some evidence that FEMA has done this over the last decade includes now having regional private sector liaisons to serve as both industry touchpoints at the regional level, including in Puerto Rico, and support capacity building at the state level. Recently, we announced public-private partnership guidance, which didn't exist a decade ago. The how-to, what does it really look like, of building these effective partnerships? An emergency support function that allows, through the National Response Framework update after the historic 2017 hurricanes and wildfires, creates meaningful doctrinal and operational coordination mechanisms for cross-sector business and infrastructure. And lastly, we now have the National BEOC that serves as a national incident point of coordination for large-scale disasters. Without these advances, it's arguable that our collective coordination over the last 18 months would have been even more daunting. In this spirit, the Chamber Foundation, FEMA, and our planning partners have worked to make this conference relevant, reflecting not just the growth of partnerships over the last decade, begin to work on issues now that will define our future. There's perhaps no better way of beginning this conference than exploring this through the 2020 takeaways and private-public partnerships, moderated by Bettina Stix, the Director of Right Now Needs and Disaster Relief at Amazon.
Everybody. I'm very excited to not see you. It's still the pandemic, so we're just virtually seeing each other. Thank you for dialing in and being interested in our topic. Thank you, Rob, for the introduction. I am the Director of Right Now Needs and Disaster Relief at Amazon and have held that position since 2017. I'm very excited today that I'm joined for this panel by Lance Pierce, the CEO of NetHope, Jennifer Pieper, the Vice President of Disaster Programs at the American Red Cross, and Dr. Michael Snyder, the Director of the Stanford Center for Genomics and Personalized Medicine. I am now going to ask all of the panelists to briefly introduce their roles and their work to us. I'll hand it over first to Lance.
Great. Thank you very much, Bettina. Thank you also to the Chamber for having us here today. It's always a pleasure to address this audience, and we look forward to a good conversation. I really also want to thank Amazon for your generous support for our work and for that of our broader membership. Again, I'm Lance Pierce. I'm the CEO of NetHope. NetHope turns 20 years old this year, and we were originally founded as a platform for public-private partnerships between some of the largest global NGOs working on humanitarian relief, development, and conservation, and over 50 of the best recognized technology brands in the world. Over 60% of all international aid distributed through NGOs every year passes through the NetHope membership. And we as an organization collaborate both on the company side as well as on the NGO side to help identify and scale up unique solutions and to use digital to better enable last mile delivery everywhere. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Lance. Jennifer, tell us about you.
Thanks, Bettina. So once again, thank you to Amazon and the Chamber for allowing us this opportunity to have this conversation. We're super excited to be here. My job in disaster cycle services for the American Red Cross is to help our teams craft and create programs that allow us to seamlessly deliver aid to communities that have been impacted by disaster across the US and then to support internationally as well. It's been a challenging couple of years for us, and COVID has definitely thrown us some curveballs, but we've been managed to learn from it and become a more agile organization because of it. So we're looking forward to the conversation today, Bettina. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very excited also to have you and Lance here, and I'm super excited also to have Dr. Snyder on the panel. Dr. Snyder, do you want to tell us a little bit what you're doing? And yours is probably the most related to the entire pandemic.
Well, thanks. My thanks as well for having me here. Yeah, we actually invent a lot of technologies and we employ big data to try and see if we can improve human health, including early disease detection. And one big area for us is wearables. And in fact, I'm wearing 4 smartwatches right now.
I'm only wearing one. Well, thank you, everyone. You've seen a little bit the introductory video, so you got a little bit of a glimpse of what Amazon is doing in the field. I'm going to just talk a little bit more about that before we dive into the work that we've done with each one of you here on the panel. So basically, 2020 will go into history. We know that now. It was such an unprecedented year. And, if you want to rewind back to the memories from last March 2020, it's almost surreal to think like how everything had shut down and, businesses, governments, and nonprofits just scrambled to adjust to the new way of life. It still feels a little bit like that, and the world is still in the midst of the pandemic. And then on top of this, Rob mentioned that in the intro, we also had a record-breaking hurricane season, 30 named storms. They had to go to the Greek alphabet for it. However, what was on the positive side and the silver lining of all of that is like the community really came together. And I think we saw just a flourishing public-private partnership landscape, and new ones emerged as well. I'll give you a little bit more background on how Amazon operates in that space. You've seen it in the video. So we try to put our operational excellence, our global logistic networks, and our innovative cloud technologies from AWS to use to provide fast and effective support worldwide for large-scale disasters and smaller disasters as well. With that in mind, Amazon has filled cargo jets, truckloads of items went to communities ravaged by hurricanes. And we sent solar-powered lights to people living without power after the tsunamis. Mark DeCourcy spoke about India. We've helped them as well with oxygen in this terrible surge of the Delta virus earlier this year. We enabled customers to easily donate products and cash on Amazon.com through technology that we have there. So since 2017, we've donated all in all more than 13 million relief items and supported people impacted by over 60 natural disasters around the world. A sad testament to how many disasters we have, but we're also proud that we could help in so many. Also, very excited on the Amazon Web Services side of the house, we've helped organizations, including governments, nonprofits, really expedite the response efforts at a scale through what we have to offer from cloud services. We also leverage, and this is something that I'm personally really kind of excited about, technical volunteers to help rebuild connectivity. And they used a mobile technology known as edge technology to allow our partners to process their data without a need of large data centers. That expedited the work of disaster response organizations in disconnected environments when there was no connectivity at all. And then in the pandemic specifically, I want to point out two things. AWS committed $20 million to launch the AWS Diagnostic Development Initiative. That's a 2-year program that helps accelerate diagnostic related research to COVID-19 and to other infectious diseases. And since March 2020, we have also been responding to COVID lockdowns by helping food banks and community organizations deliver groceries for free for those that are in lockdown, totaling over 12 million meals delivered to vulnerable families and children in 25 cities in the US, and also in communities in Australia, Singapore, Japan, Spain, and the UK. So that was a lot of Amazon. I'm handing it over now to our partners. And first I want to talk to Lance. Lance, NetHope and connectivity, those are almost synonyms. So let's talk a little bit about connectivity. And I'm curious to hear, why is connectivity such an important part to building resilience? And then how have you guys worked with us here at Amazon and AWS really to bring this to communities?
Thanks, Bettina. Happy to jump in on that. I should say as well that we're very proud to note that the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies is a member organization of NetHope, and we frequently work alongside the National Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations around the world in our direct response. So it's great to be on stage with Jennifer here as well, as a fellow traveler in the NetHope outreach and response work that we do. As you say, Bettina, connectivity is just increasingly synonymous and essential when it comes to emergency response as well as recovery. Gone are the days of loading up a Land Rover or a helicopter with supplies and then randomly passing out relief items to the people you happen to see on the way. The life-saving supplies and material that get distributed today are done so far more effectively because aid organizations can use technology and share data and information to know where the most impacted populations are located. They're better able to track effective delivery of aid through digitized and connected supply chains, and they're better able to ensure distribution to the greatest points of need across a wider range of geographic locations. And so in those instances, data and connectivity are lifesavers. Quite literally. And over the last 20 years, NetHope's played a key role in providing emergency telecoms and data solutions to assist relief workers in impacted communities. And as you mentioned, we've got a few recent examples of that where we've worked directly with you. Last November, when Hurricane Iota struck Nicaragua, Honduras, and the neighboring countries, the capacity of first responders and existing infrastructure were already stretched thin after Hurricane Eta only 2 weeks earlier. So either one of these two storms, Eta at Category 4 or Iota at Category 5, would have been devastating all by itself. And according to researchers, Central America had only been hit by 4 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes in its known history prior to 2020. So there was almost no preparation for events on this scale. Eta and Iota, of course, hit the region only 2 weeks apart, and it resulted in the worst extreme weather-related devastation in this region that's been seen within living memory. So the situation really made it hard for our member organizations, the nonprofits in our membership, to conduct the important relief work that they do. But with support from the AWS Disaster Response Program, we were able to launch a 7-month collaborative project to increase the response and the coordination capacity of all the NetHope member organizations, as well as a number of other humanitarian agencies, including UN agencies and others in Nicaragua, by providing access to free Wi-Fi connectivity. Now, as you might also imagine, this was really no mean feat, given that much of the world was still in full lockdown due to the pandemic. So crossing international borders was difficult at best, and in some cases impossible. And the region itself was already under-resourced and struggling to control its borders against the spread of COVID-19. But despite all of this, we were able to mount an effective response. We were able to help our member NGOs and the other organizations doing direct response in the region. We helped them connect, track, deliver, save lives, and serve communities in the process. With Amazon, we and the NetHope member organizations executed 37 different aid programs, and we supported literally thousands of recipients in the process. And we also enabled member organizations to share vital information, such as locations for safe shelter and where to seek medical care. And also, as part of this, we tried to leave behind important skills that are going to be needed in the future. So as part of this, we trained local technicians to ensure that there was local capacity to maintain and troubleshoot the installed Wi-Fi networks. Our rapid response team at NetHope relies on our company partners for volunteer staff. Our company partners provide surge capacity. They often act as subject matter experts in the field. And in particular, we've leveraged AWS technical volunteers, including in 2019 during Hurricane Dorian, when it became one of the 2 most powerful storms to make landfall from the Atlantic. With support from the AWS Disaster Response Program, we were able to deploy to some of the hardest hit areas to help set up communications and connectivity at more than 40 different medical facilities and shelters in Nassau and Abaco and the Bahamas. I think just in conclusion, I'll say, it's one thing to provide a donation, and as a not-for-profit organization, I certainly don't want to minimize that. We do need your donations and we need your contributions to help support our work. But it's another thing entirely to deploy side by side in a crisis, as we've been able to do with AWS. And so we've been very fortunate as a not-for-profit organization to have a long history of strong and effective partnerships in this regard, and it's indispensable for us to do our work and to be able to help us directly and all of our member organizations better serve the people that they're trying to help in times of crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Lance. I think what I'm most proud of in the story is like the scale that we could achieve together, right? Like how you, through this partnership, how you could reach 37 different organizations in Central America at that time. And then how just like by creating connectivity, you get everybody back into work. I want to pivot over to kind of some other form of connectivity. In the pandemic, luckily that wasn't a disaster where connectivity failed, but where connectivity and Wi-Fi technology, remote technology really became super, super important. So I spoke earlier about the Diagnostic Development Initiative, and Stanford University was one of the organizations that used the program to harness cloud technology to advance their work. Dr. Snyder, tell me a little bit what you did with that. What did you do with the partnership through the initiative? And how will it help you also prepare for the future, or what comes after that?
Sure. So we had found before the pandemic that, believe it or not, we could detect when people are getting ill from an infection, from infectious disease prior to symptoms. So we'd shown it for Lyme disease and respiratory viral infections, because it turns out your resting heart rate and other physiological parameters will change before a symptoms onset. And so when the pandemic hit, as you might imagine, we wanted to try and apply this and see if we could improve it for COVID detection. And so partnering with the AWS, the Diagnostic Development Initiative, we did just that. We first showed that we could detect COVID with a simple smartwatch in advance of symptoms. It turns out a median of 4 days prior to symptom onset, which we think is a pretty big deal. And then basically we also, developed the apps, improved the algorithms. And then the biggest part was just trying to build a scalable system. We want to build a system that can hit ultimately the entire planet. Our modest goals right now are millions of people, ideally 10 million people we want to get signed up. We have thousands now. And we have built a real-time alerting system. So we went from just saying retrospectively, we can detect when you're getting ill, and we know what happens again before symptoms, to now being able to set up an alerting system. And we've just rolled out this part of the study. So we will ping you with a red alert when we first see your heart rate, when we see an outlying measurement, suggests that something's off. Now, it's not always COVID. It could be another illness, and it could be other things will trigger this, but it does happen many of the times. It is COVID, in fact. So we can show this now prospectively, again, that we can detect when you're getting ill prior to symptoms, works 78% of the time. And remarkably, it even picks up asymptomatic cases. So we can see when someone's heart rate is jumping up. We have 10 instances of this, and no symptoms are there, but they get a test, and sure enough, they're positive. So we think this kind of technology is scalable. It can hit all parts of the planet. 60% of the planet has a smartphone. You do it all through a cloud-based system. And so we think it really requires, a basically very large infrastructure. So we built a data ocean, we like to call it. We think it's a lot bigger than a lake now, which is commonly used. It's quite a system that we're building with Amazon to do just what I said, to be able to imagine a world where we can detect illness before symptoms in a large fraction of cases. And we think that's going to be powerful, not just for pandemics, but for human health, just managing that in general. So that's our goal, that's our vision, and that's what we're trying to do.
This is so exciting. I wish, we had that before this pandemic and everybody was already on your system. Maybe it would have never developed into the pandemic it unfortunately is today. Just wanted to also quickly mention these $20 million for the Diagnostic Development Initiative has so far helped 87 organizations. That if anybody here on the program remains open to applicants through December of this year. And at the end of our panel, we'll also direct you to our booth where you can learn more about that. Now pivoting to something a lot more down to earth, not in the data ocean. So I wanted to talk quickly about how we have opened our disaster relief hub. It's in Atlanta. Amazon now has set aside space where we're donating storage and logistical services to help with over 500,000 emergency relief items. Our organizations who are partnering with us. And the greatness about all of this is this has happened due to feedback from the American Red Cross and other partners we had. We are now pre-positioning items there for the Red Cross, but also for the International Federation of the Red Cross and other partners. So Jennifer, tell us a little bit about how this disaster hub helps your organization and what the Red Cross vision is to scale even further. What are opportunities that are there? And then what would a future disaster relief operation look like with items that are stored in a hub provided by a partner?
Absolutely. So, I think first and foremost, a hub based in Atlanta, which allows an excellent launching point, not only for the Southeast US, but also the Caribbean and Central America is critical. And folks who work in disaster relief operations will tell you the one thing you cannot afford to lose on an operation is time. And so speed to scale is a critical function of being there and being present in the community to deliver immediate aid. We see this a lot, especially when you look at island communities like Puerto Rico for Hurricane Maria or the Bahamas for Hurricane Dorian. The ability to get in and deliver massive amounts of emergency supplies is absolutely critical to stabilizing that environment once it's been impacted by a disaster. Amazon's commitment to this has been huge for us. We are experts at typically what communities need immediately after disaster, depending on the type of disaster that's impacted. And Amazon's commitment to stock those much needed items in a hub that allows us to deliver them faster is it's an amazing opportunity that we're able to now bring to our communities. What does it look like in the future? Well, it feels weird to step into Michael's world a little bit, but it is about data. It's about data lakes. It's about data oceans now, and understanding what the impact is in that community, and not only using that for us as an organization, but sharing that with other organizations so that we can help paint a picture of the overall impact of the community. What we see time and time again is the Red Cross cannot be the sole provider of disaster relief services. It takes a community, it takes NetHope, it takes other nonprofits, it takes for-profit organizations. And if we all come together and we're able to share situational awareness, we make much better real-time decisions to get the community exactly what it needs, when it needs it, exactly where it needs to be delivered. And that's really kind of the magic equation to making sure that we can stabilize that community in the first couple of days past a disaster. And Hurricane Dorian, a prime example of that, right? You've got an island, transportation in, dropping supplies, huge logistical challenges presented there. And Amazon was able to get a plane over there and get critical medical and disaster relief supplies delivered immediately to help stabilize as the rest of our organizations could kind of rally and bring in additional supplies. So it's incredible the opportunities we have there. As we will tell people all the time, when you respond to a disaster relief operation, it is like setting up a small or medium business in about 48 hours. You have to set up all the logistical support, how to support incoming volunteers, and then how to deliver services to the community. It can be a crazy challenge, but one that, you know, our organization is up to, but only with the partnerships like Amazon and other nonprofits. So we're so excited to be here and be able to share some of the best practices that we've learned over time.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left. I just want to go around really quickly, and maybe in one sentence, give me your biggest insight, what you've learned through partnerships in the pandemic. Just like one sentence. Jennifer, since we have you already on screen, why don't you start?
I'd love to kick off. I think what we have learned is that information is the power to unlocking incredibly successful partnerships. And the more information we're able to gather ourselves and from partners helps everybody help that community recover faster.
Great. Dr. Snyder?
Oh, I would say it's bringing together complementary expertise. I think the ability to move around large amounts of data that Amazon's good at with very expert engineers. I think with some of the brilliant people in my lab who are pretty amazing at putting together algorithms for these sensitive detections, it's just a winning combination. And everybody brings something to the table to solve a pretty complicated problem.
Great. Lance?
Yes, I think one thing we've observed in the early days of some of these partnerships, there was an attempt to work in an aggregator fashion through organizations like NetHope. In fact, that's why we were founded. Then as companies, programs matured, their CSR departments matured, their partnerships matured, they began to go build their own relationships there in the middle decade or so. And now what we see is companies are coming back to work through us in a more aggregated way, in part because digital is everywhere. It's embedded in everything. It's ubiquitous. You can't do any work without digital and connectivity. And so we're finding that companies are coming back to work through us in an aggregated fashion because we can be a place to work with all the key stakeholders everywhere in the world, including the United States, where over half of our members work, and a place where you can engage through technology solutions that are now enabling and driving the next generation delivery and service at scale.
And Lance, and then I'll pass that question on also to everybody else. What do you see as the next trends in disaster relief and response? Maybe specifically related to technology.
Well, I think and especially in the wake of the pandemic, every every organization has really discovered the importance of investing in their technology backbone to improve connectivity. I mean, much of the work that we do is inherently in person. And so it's been challenging when you have a business that operates on an in-person basis that's had to go virtual. So technology has forced a lot of creativity. Certainly the theme of this conference about the new normal. It's going to change the ways that we work together. And I think what we and our members and our partners are looking to do is to really learn from that experience so that we can take the best of what it's been like to be virtual and go back to being in person in ways that are more efficient, more effective, and to balance that hybrid. So I think you're going to see us, certainly all of our member organizations, as well as many companies, starting to work in that vein in the wake of the pandemic.
Great. Dr. Snyder?
Yeah, I mean, I would say connectivity and digital health is here to stay. I think we're going to get better and better at that. I think nobody really wants to go to a doctor's office to get sick. I think they'd rather be diagnosed as much as possible in their own home. But the other part, I would say that to pick up on Jennifer's point, I think data sharing is really, really important in a pandemic. I think people can't underestimate how valuable that is to be able to share data across very diverse locations and being able to put together, especially when you're trying to do very new, innovative things, just have to get access to data and it has to be in a form that you can work with at scale. So I think data sharing, I hope will be here to stay. I think people still tend to hoard their data a little more than I'd like to see, but I hope we can make that a staple for all things going forward.
Thank you. And Jennifer, I'm going to throw an audience question to you that may be related also to technology. What do you need to do to develop and ensure the resilience of buildings as shelters of most human activity in support of building resilience? So how can we help buildings be more resilient, especially when it comes to supporting disaster relief?
So I think the first and foremost is know your most likely hazard or disaster, right? Not all disasters impact all different kinds of physical structures in the same way. So we see time and time mitigation, raising things, making them more resilient to high winds or to storm surge or to inland flooding, all of those things. When you think about the West Coast, you're looking at defensible areas around structures and clearing out old debris. There is a lot of mitigation that can go on. I think the other piece is that unfortunately, we keep seeing every hurricane season is unprecedented, right? But then the next year, Mother Nature comes along and makes us eat our words yet again. And I think for us, what we're seeing in some places is this repetitive loss, is the same communities being impacted time and time again. And so it's not always just about the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, but it's about the socioeconomic infrastructure inside those communities and how we really use data to target those very vulnerable communities and invest more time and more resources there to make sure that they're able to become as resilient as some of the other more well-funded communities. And so for us, that's part of what we're looking at in the future is not every community bounces back in the same way or on the same timeline. And there are strategic and tactical interventions that we can do to help people bounce back better and bounce back sooner. And that's really one of the things we're going to be focused on in the coming years.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. We're coming to the end of our segment. I wanted to just point everybody to the virtual exhibit booth that you have in your materials that you can access to learn some more of these about these partnerships and how Amazon has helped in disasters. I also wanted to quickly just share something I'm personally very excited about, and that is our new leadership principle. We have, as you may know, Amazon had 14 leadership principles in the past that really guide how we operate our business. And one of the newer ones is success and scale bring broad responsibility. Amazon really started in the garage, but we're not there anymore. We are big, we impact the world, and we are far from perfect. So we're trying to stay humble and thoughtful about even the secondary effects of our action. Our local communities, planet, and future generations need us to be better every day. We must begin each day with the determination to make better, to do better, and be better for our customers, our employees, our partners, and the world at large. And we must end every day knowing we can do even more tomorrow. Leaders create more than they consume and always leave things better than how they found them. With that, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to all the panel members for your time today.
Good afternoon to all. I'm Bill Raish. I'm most happy to be joining you from our Intercept Center at NYU, where we focus very much like this conference on bringing together key stakeholders on neutral ground to collaborate on shared challenges and threats. The current and certainly continuing pandemic presented a wide spectrum of challenges to all our organizations. We've had successes and failures and much in between as we navigate through these difficult times. We're looking at some of those challenges and lessons learned today through 4 distinct yet arguably complementary lenses. We have Lieutenant Colonel Matt Cavanaugh, an Army strategist and also academic, who is joining us from Northcom NORAD. He will bring a wider global military perspective to the equation. Joining him will be Jason McNamara, Director of the Center for Emergency Management Operations at CNA Corporation. Jason brings a tremendous depth of experience and knowledge from decades of interaction with local, state, and federal emergency management. Joining as well will be Catherine Boatwright. She is Director of Operations for the National VOAD, and with her comes a perspective on the not-for-profit and NGO community, which has certainly served vital roles throughout this ongoing crisis. And then finally, we have Colonel Brandy Williams. She's Chief of the Plans Division of National Guard Bureau. She brings with her the distinct lens that the National Guard has from its unique role in serving both on the state level, if you will, the local level, and responding to emergencies, as well as certainly warfighting when called upon. From these diverse perspectives, our goal will be to tease out real world and very fresh lessons learned from the ongoing pandemic, with a focus on maybe some actionable insights and strategies going forward that all of us in the greater community can potentially apply. We've only got about 3 to 5 minutes for an overview from each of our thought leaders here, but we hope to have a little time at the end of our discussion to respond to questions and certainly welcome them throughout via the chat function. I'm going to mix things up a bit and suggest a reverse order from your program and ask Colonel Williams to lead off. Colonel Williams, what, from your perspective, have been the greatest insights and lessons learned from the National Guard during this past 18 months or so?
Good afternoon, Bill, and thank you for that great introduction. And so it is my distinct pleasure to sit on this panel to talk about an extremely relevant topic as we learn to navigate the new normal. The theme of the whole of community response in a post-pandemic is definitely fitting and correlates to the mission and role of the National Guard. Because we pride ourselves in being citizen soldiers and working side by side with our state, local, tribal, and federal partners to provide a service for the local communities. The National Guard, by its very nature, is the connective tissue between the military and the community that we live and serve in. So the COVID pandemic has definitely challenged the National Guard men and women to think out of the box, to create and innovative and skills that we acquire through both the military and our civilian jobs, and to apply those unique skill sets into a different way. So all of the unique challenges that the pandemic has placed on our organization and apply those and unique and also how we collaborate with others. For example, when about PPE requirements, National Guard became increasingly creative. We began, guardsmen in California and Colorado began sewing face masks for the National Guard soldiers and airmen. And then as we created so many, we started to distribute that vital resource to our communities. We also embrace virtual collaboration tools, and these tools have enabled us to continue to do our operations. And it also helped us no longer be restricted to geographical boundaries that we see in traditional settings. Going forward, I do believe that the biggest challenge that the National Guard will face is managing our role in support of the Homeland Defense, while also providing a vital service in our defense support to civil authorities. We have to learn how to live post-pandemic while also responding to national incidents such as hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, and civil disturbance. Relying on our limited resources that most of my comrades understand and live through on a daily basis. But with the National Guard, we also have to conduct readiness training to meet our federal obligation. Some of the other challenges that we also identified was building enhanced information sharing tools, conducting collaborative training, and also how do we reach out to a wider range of partners from all sectors of the community and government. And I believe that if we focus on these efforts to ensure continued success for us all, we as an organization and as a broader community can learn how to overcome the obstacles that we're facing now and learn how to navigate this new normal. In many ways, I believe the pandemic has strengthened us, not just the National Guard, but all of our partners. And I'm confident that the challenges that we have faced and continue to face will only strengthen our ability to better plan and respond to multi-layered incidents as a whole of community partners. The importance of this shared and renewed sense of purpose, it will promote inclusion, innovation, collaboration, teamwork, mutual trust, and mutual understanding, which I believe are keys to success in living in a post-pandemic era. Now, please do not get me wrong. I am by no means saying that the pandemic is over. But what I am saying is that we need to capture those lessons learned, and in capturing those, apply those lessons learned so that we learn how to operate in this new environment. We should never try to go back to pre-pandemic operations, but continue to utilize and incorporate all of the skills that we have acquired to enhance what we do and to help us better manage and prepare for the challenges of the future. I'm proud of the work that the National Guard has done. Not only did the National Guard support its communities, but the nation as a whole. We take this charge not lightly. We do it with enthusiasm and excitement because we take pride in what the services that we provide to our nation and the communities. And I believe that as we move forward, we will only strengthen and rely and learn from our partners to do more for the community. So thank you for my time, and back to you, Bill.
Colonel, thank you very much, and sincere thanks to you and all your comrades for your tremendous service throughout this crisis. Catherine Boatwright, you head up operations at the National VOAD. There, you've got a wide range of not-for-profits and NGOs that have been extremely active and impactful throughout the crisis. What do you think the greatest lessons learned have been both for and from the VOAD community?
Well, thank you, Bill. And this has been a tremendous time, right? None of us came out unscathed as to the pandemic, the economic impact, and the natural disasters that followed. You know, I would say that the one thing that is a takeaway is that the nonprofit sector will do whatever it takes to continue to serve the population that it serves. We saw nonprofits, first of all, taking their full workforce digital, which when we're talking about people who rely on human connectivity was a huge lift. We're talking about nonprofits who specialize in construction are all of a sudden sewing masks. Nonprofits who are delivering meals are now running restaurants and helping to keep those small businesses afloat by using funds that they would have normally used for direct feeding to paying restaurant workers. So just tremendous creativity. And I hope that we never lose that. I will say that we have a few challenges on the horizon for us. And that is, you know, in everything that we do, we thrive on partnerships. National VOAD works to incorporate the 4 C's: communication, collaboration, coordination, and cooperation into everything that we do. And that's true across industry lines as well. One thing that we are looking at is in March of 2020 of this year, Candid released a study along with the Center of Disaster Philanthropy stating that it's possible that 1/3 of nonprofits could close within the next 2 years because of financial instability. That is a huge number. And when we're talking about the most at risk of that number, it's those smaller community-based organizations. Now, for every day, you may think, well, not a big deal, they have a small impact. However, they are the most integrated in their community. They have the most knowledge of the local culture, resources, and relationships. And for national nonprofits in a response and recovery setting, they are who we partner with to make sure that we are doing the most good for that local community. And we want the local experts at the same table with us. So that would be a tremendous loss if we saw that. So we're looking to see how we can support and subgrant and do whatever we can for those smaller community-based organizations as national nonprofits. During the pandemic, there was a huge shortage of volunteers due to the safety implications, of course. So many volunteers are in that higher risk category. I will say that a huge lesson learned was creativity in how we deployed volunteers, how we housed volunteers, and even digital volunteerism that we saw a huge increase in that I hope we keep. Now, as the population becomes more vaccinated, we're seeing mandates being lifted, which is wonderful. However, nonprofits are trying to navigate what the policies are in regards to deploying their workforce. Are they requiring vaccinations? Are they looking at vaccinated numbers to the communities that they are deploying to? Are they mandating certain restrictions as far as keeping social distancing, masks, et cetera? All of these things that we have became very used to and are quickly becoming very unused to them, right? As we try to crawl our way out of this pandemic, but we know due to the Delta variant that it is far from over. So there's a real challenge as to trying to make these decisions and discern as the government is releasing these mandates, and nonprofits want to keep their workforce safe, their volunteers safe, and the communities that they are serving and traveling to often safe. So that's a huge challenge right now. And I will just say that, you know, we've all mentioned the unprecedented year that 2020 was, both as a pandemic and natural disasters, and we're seeing a continuous increase in those billion-dollar disasters. Since 1980, NOAA has tracked billion-dollar disasters, which, if you're unfamiliar with that term, those are disasters that cause more than 1 billion in damage to communities. In 2020, there were 22 disasters that caused over $1 billion, and that's the most ever on record. And I'll just tell you that that number has doubled in the previous 2 decades, from 63 in the early 2000s to 123 in the second decade there. It takes all of us to come to the table to figure this out, because billions of dollars, no one's got that bank account, and that's not even to take into account the tremendous loss of life and trauma that communities experience. So I think a huge takeaway is that we saw the creativity in all of the partners coming to the table to figure out these enormous hurdles, and I think we need to continue that and to not just come to the table, but stay at the table.
Catherine, sincere thanks, and real concern certainly about, as you mentioned, maybe up to 1/3 of the not-for-profits are, potentially threatened over the next several years. And that's something obviously we all need to look at very closely. Jason McNamara, changing a lens slightly, although certainly within the same wider domain. You've had nearly 30 years of emergency management engagement on the federal, state, and local levels. What do you think the greatest lessons learned have been for the emergency management community throughout this crisis? Jason will be joining us momentarily while we work through some audio issues here. We're about to see if Jason is proficient in sign language. We will. I'm going to suggest, perhaps with the concurrence of others, that while Jason works through his audio, I'm going to go to
Check 1, 2. Can you hear me now?
There we go, Jason.
All right. I don't know what happened. I was on the right microphone.
This is all about emergency management. You handle it well.
Exactly. In any event, what I said was because I don't work for the government anymore, I can be a little provocative here, so I'm gonna do that. The main issue that I think folks need to take away from COVID is, frankly, twofold. Main issues, pardon me, are twofold. Number one is we really need to stop thinking about disasters in terms of seasonality, in terms of cycles, in terms of, okay, we'll get some time off. Even I was guilty of that when working in the business for as many years as I did. Usually between about December and February, you have a little bit of time off in terms of national disasters. That is not the case anymore. There really is no disaster season. As was just pointed out, the $1 billion disasters are going up. So that has implications, significant implications for both federal, state, local, nonprofits, the military, in terms of their posture, when they're able to respond, how they can keep people trained up. And it's going to have a significant, I think, very significant impacts on overall plans, processes, training, moving forward. You're not going to have kind of the other duties as assigned jobs that you'll see in other organizations now. They're going to be people dedicated to incident management on a full-time basis. Some of you may be surprised, but FEMA really does still use the kind of, for lack of a better word, the volunteer model during disasters. There's a small cadre of people that work incidents on a regular basis, but when the big ones come, they really have to kind of either use surge support or use different parts of the agency. I see that changing. I see that becoming more regularized. Second thing is with respect to emergency management relationship with the private sector. One of the things that came out of COVID was usually when you're responding to a disaster, the whole issue is taking things that from other places, things that exist, things that there is plenty of supply of, and moving them into the impacted area to address the problems. That could be generators, that could be food, that could be water, that could be a variety of things. What COVID brought to the fore, and it's now a major issue that people are considering, is what happens when those resources aren't available? What do you do in a resource scarce environment? What if there is no PPE? What if there aren't enough pharmaceuticals to go around? What are the next steps there, and who is responsible for that? And a lot of that was figured out, as I think many of you know, on the fly during the disaster. I think FEMA is spending a lot of time rethinking what its interactions with the private sector look like. What are the priorities? And as opposed to kind of the old way of thinking, where FEMA, will fill in the gaps that are created by the disaster, it's really more of a matter of how do we reestablish what was there before, and particularly in a resource scarcity environment, how do we look to other and new partners to bring those resources in where desired? So I think it's going to have I know it's already had significant changes in the way people are thinking about incident management. And I do encourage all those folks watching to kind of stay tuned and frankly, become engaged. I think there's a big opportunity now for the private sector to become more engaged in a way that they believe is most effective, and how they can be most effective during disasters. And I think FEMA, state and local governments are open to that now. Thanks, Bill, and I'm sorry for the tech difficulties.
No problem. And that's all part of the equation here. Jason, sincere thanks. Appreciate the insights. Colonel Kavanaugh, I wanted to keep you at the end because quite frankly, you have the largest lens on all of this. You're a warfighter, Army strategist. You've done substantial work also in the academic community, reflecting on much of this. What do you see as the greatest lessons, both for our military going forward, but also those that might be applicable to wider society, if you will?
So thanks, Bill. And when I think about national security in whole of community challenges, it makes me want to walk you through some global headlines. So late 2019, an Iranian missile attack wrecks 2 Saudi oil fields, a direct military strike on a soft target in the homeland critical to national infrastructure or society's essential needs. And oil to Saudi Arabia is about as essential as it gets. Russia's repeatedly crippled the Ukrainian power grid. Russia's used Novichok, an advanced chemical weapon, to carry out an attack in the United Kingdom. In 2015, China hacked the US Office of Personnel Management and stole 4 million federal employee records, including myself and probably a couple others on this panel. And Kim Jong-un, I saved my favorite for the end, leading North Korea with roughly the same economic size as the economy of Colorado Springs, can threaten far-off cities with strategic strike. And let me double down on that. So the North Korean GDP is less than half what Americans spend on their pets every year, and he has long-range nukes. So the tools to strike are cheaper than ever, and homelands are getting harder than ever before. I didn't even bring up the Colonial Pipeline. So war's changed. And it's not exclusively nuclear. The doomsday clock has been set closer to midnight than ever before, but nuclear weapons are down over 80% from their Cold War high. So there's 2 parts in the challenges to national security, in my mind, going forward. What's most valuable to us is now most vulnerable to our adversaries. They have the tools to inflict pain without all the muss and fuss of a nuclear weapon. Second, and this one rattles me a little bit, our American sense of camouflage containment won't hold anymore. By that, I mean the idea that war can be restricted to a battlefield, or that those of us in uniform can keep the consequences from those not in uniform. It's so much more likely now that when the nation next goes to war, war will come to the nation. So Catherine mentioned whatever it takes. And that is probably the motto for everybody that's standing here on this Zoom call. She's absolutely right. But if I had one wish, I'd add one word. It's whatever it takes together, because I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to make this work. So thanks so much for your time, Bill, and thanks to everybody else on the panel today.
I'm going to actually lead off. We have a brief period of time remaining. Maybe I'm going to stay with you, Colonel, and ask if there was if you could make that a little more actionable. If you had to choose one particular actionable takeaway that you could charge all of us with going forward, what would it be?
Okay. It used to be, frankly, that we dealt with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse individually. But today it seems much, much more likely that we're going to face them all at once. It takes a team to fight those 4 horsemen. And bear with me just momentarily. I have small kids, and a lot of you would know the book, Shel Silverstein's book, The Missing Piece. It's a pretty simple concept. It's a little character that looks like Pac-Man, and he rolls through the whole book looking for someone to make him whole. And I think of all these organizations represented on this panel like individually missing pieces. The only way that we're going to make this work is if we layer our work together on top of one another to make a completed whole. We've all got strengths, we're either a helping hand, or we build back, or we're a local face, or security and unique assets. And we all want to protect and safeguard Americans. So if you ask me, it's a lot of handshakes, it's conversations like these, it's getting to know people before the worst happens.
Thank you. And I'm going to follow through with the deference, hopefully, of our wider mentors here, or I should say MCs. Jason, a really quick takeaway that you think is actionable.
Yeah, I'll follow on to that, which is, yes, everybody's got to get on board. And frankly, it's got to be much more institutionalized than it already is. I think, and I'm not saying that everybody's going to follow the same playbook, but it cannot be a pickup team, to continue on this analogy. People have to get engaged. We have to recognize that in order to be successful, that full team has to be engaged. And then third, how do you do that in a way that regularizes it, institutionalizes it, and you can turn on a dime on it? That's really what's required in this day and age with the threats that we face. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Catherine, your take.
Thank you. I would just echo what's been said in that, reach across the table, across the industry lines before the event happens. Events like today are so critical. You don't want to be meeting someone for the first time after a disaster has hit. So meet someone new, exchange a business card, and be honest about what you have and what you don't have. I think we often like to save face, say, here's what I have, here's what I don't have. How can we move forward?
And Colonel, tying a bow on it, what would you suggest?
Yes, sir. And so I just want to echo what the rest of the panel members said, with a heavy footstep on increased collaboration with NGOs and nonprofit organizations and other federal agencies, because we need to learn how to better collaborate and share information so that we're all operating with the same shared understanding. So.
Terrific. And sincere thanks to all of you, to DHS, certainly Northcom, and of course to the U.S. Chamber.
Right now, there are millions of people going about their daily lives. Some are facing hard times, and others just need a little help. It might be needing a warm meal, access to clean water, or help starting a new business. It could be reliable, climate-friendly transportation, a place to get a potentially life-saving vaccine, or even relief on the worst days of their lives. It's our goal to positively impact 50 million people by our 50th anniversary in 2023. FedEx Cares 50 by 50. Follow the journey on FedExCares.com.
Thank you, Jim, for all your work at the White House and also from your previous work at the State Department. America's in good hands with you on the job. And Heather from Direct Relief, Shane and Heather from FedEx. We so appreciate the insightful discussion that you shared with us. Now it's my honor to introduce our next speaker, FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell. Prior to her appointment as FEMA Administrator, Ms. Criswell served as the Commissioner of the New York City Emergency Management Department. There, she was responsible for overseeing the city's efforts to plan and prepare for emergencies, educate the public about preparedness, coordinate emergency response and recovery, and disseminate emergency information. It's a lot. What was once a COVID-19 epicenter, we all remember that. She was also there and led New York City's response to the pandemic, preventing the collapse of the healthcare system that was so fragile at the time, working to make sure that no New Yorker went hungry. She also established a first of its kind non-congregate sheltering program, and so much more. From severe flooding in North Dakota to hurricanes in South Carolina to fires in Colorado, for years, she has led different organizations on changing how they did response to disaster, how they planned for recovery. She just pretty much done it all. And now she's at FEMA. Welcome, Administrator Criswell. It is such a pleasure to have you with us here today.
Mark, thank you so much. And thanks to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation for hosting this event today. It's truly an honor to join you and be able to speak with everybody today. In years to come, we're going to look at the COVID-19 pandemic as a turning point in emergency management. What we saw is that we were stretched, not just with our resources, but we stretched emergency management, the emergency management system, in ways that we have never done before. COVID itself has propelled emergency management to the forefront of relevancy in this post-pandemic environment. And COVID was not easy, and we're not out of the woods just yet. So I want to challenge all of you, FEMA included, to turn your attention toward the future. We've learned so much in the past year, and now we must leverage what we've learned to aggressively plan, invest, and build for the future. This is an opportunity before us to rethink our systems, our investments, our resources, and our decisions. We need to grab this opportunity and chart a new way forward to build partnerships, grow the field, and push sound policies for the future. So what have we learned from COVID-19? Well, first, we learned that resilience isn't just a buzzword. True resilience comes from deep within a community, deep within its economy, its services, and the bonds people share with each other. It's the community coming together, planning, adapting, changing, and finding a new way forward. I saw this in New York City last year, where I was the Emergency Management Commissioner. And in the height of the pandemic, we worked with private companies to help support our PPE supply chain. We must continue to open this aperture toward a broader concept of community resilience, and this is the only way that we're going to be successful at navigating future disasters. We also learned that a ready nation means a prepared and resilient nation. We are one part of a system of resilience, and we all share a responsibility for readiness. Our responsibility is to leverage the capability across all sectors to promote sound decision-making before, during, and after disasters. For FEMA, this means that we must work closer with the private sector, especially in supply chain management and logistics. We must also work closer with a broad range of nonprofit organizations beyond those that we traditionally partner with. We must use data-driven approaches to close the capability gaps that we've seen, especially those related to national security, continuity, and this new wildland-urban interface fire threats that we're seeing right now. We must improve and standardize our disaster program delivery to ensure consistency across all of our regions and our states. We must modernize our grant systems to be user-centric, focused on threats and hazards to buy down risk. FEMA and the nation must be ready, and our collaboration with business and industry leaders is an important part, a critical piece of this readiness. FEMA's push for the National Response Framework's Emergency Support Function 14, or ESF 14, supports and aligns cross-sector operations among our infrastructure owners and operators, businesses, and government partners to help stabilize community lifelines during a disaster. The activation of ESF 14 was critical in coordinating with our industry partners in our response to COVID-19, along with our partners at CISA and other interagency partners. FEMA's National Business Emergency Operations Center, housed within our Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration, continues to be the national go-to for business and industry during crisis, with a record activation of 435 days during the COVID-19 response. And we are learning from these partnerships as we look ahead to future threats. This also means not just doing what we've always done before. We must invest in the future in bigger and bolder ways. Climate change is here. Storms are increasing in intensity, and we see historic wildfires year after year. We will not be capable of responding to these future threats if we don't invest now. Our money, time, and energy must be oriented toward the future, not just the short term. And at FEMA, we are expanding our investment in resilience through hazard mitigation grants. We know that every dollar the federal government invests in mitigation sees a $6 return. Earlier this month, we announced the first $700 million in mitigation grants to make communities stronger, including more than $26 million to tribal governments. And in the next few weeks, we will be releasing a $1 billion Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC funding notification for fiscal year 21. FEMA's investment through mitigation is just one part of building resilience nationwide. You play a critical role in building resilience through the partnerships that you forge and foster. The future of our nation will depend on it. The public-private relationships, those connections, keep our system of resilience strong, healthy, and adaptable for whatever we might see next. Finally, we've learned that the cascading effects of hazards and disasters impact our communities differently. COVID was a stark reminder that disasters disproportionately affect our underserved communities. To build a stronger future, we must improve access to resources and ensure the relatability of our information and the actions we ask people to take. Bottom line, we must advance equity before, during, and after disasters. If we're going to invest in our communities, we must invest in the whole community, not just those who can afford it and live without real systemic barriers. The onus is on us to chart this path forward. We, all of us together, must make and continue to make equity a part of our conversation. We must meet people where they are. We must find innovative ways to build capacity for everyone. During the COVID-19 vaccine mission, we oriented our community vaccination centers toward advancing equity. The center locations were strategically chosen, and our outreach was tailored toward the underserved. As a result, more than 58% of all doses administered at the federal pilot sites went to communities of color, which is much higher than the national average of non-white vaccination rates. The lesson that we learned was that advancing equity means intentional decision-making. It means planning for the future with a deliberate focus on turning equity ideas into action. Last week, we announced 2 new initiatives, an agency-wide steering group and the development of our 5-year strategic plan to advance equity across our agency. These early steps will focus the agency toward reducing the barriers and increasing opportunities for the health of our workforce and survivors. We have a long way to go in advancing equity across the resilience space, but I am very optimistic about the future. We are all part of building resilience, and together we can go beyond, far beyond what we can do alone. So one of the greatest lessons from COVID is that we are all connected. Our communities extend beyond our neighborhoods and cities. Our future is intertwined. I feel a strong sense of urgency about the future, and I really hope that you feel it too. A stronger, more resilient future is within our grasp, and we just need to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Welcome to our panel on creating investment approach to thriving instead of surviving. It's very apropos given the comments from the administrator just before. Thank you to the Chamber Foundation and all of you for including the U.S. Chamber and our expert panel in this important discussion. The Chamber has long supported building smart, modern, resilient infrastructure as part of its approach to improve the way in which our country addresses our infrastructure challenges. Companies and communities are looking to reduce the risks and prepare ahead of the next disaster. And pre-disaster mitigation, which is what the administrator was alluding to, is at the heart of that, those issues. We have a very impressive panel of speakers and not a lot of time to get through that panel. And given our focus on the Olympics this week, I think it's very appropriate that we're going to be sprinting through this panel discussion. So what I'll do is I'll introduce our panel in full, and then I'll go back and I'll ask you one at a time some questions to respond to. And then if we have some time left, we'll have some discussion, and then if we can, have some questions and answers. So we have 4 panelists. We have Alejandro Contreras. He's Director of Preparedness, Communication Coordination at the Office of Disaster Assistance of the Small Business Administration. We have Kevin Bush. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs, Office of Community Planning at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have Camille Crane. She's the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC Program Section Chief at FEMA. And then we have Luke Apicella. He's the Vice President of Impact Investments at Prudential. And Luke, I'd like to start with you and talk a little bit about why building resilience and making investments in issues around pre-disaster mitigation is important for the insurance sector and the private sector in general, and what that means to your insurance portfolio and your overall approach to investments.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity. Really happy to be here. So I'll take that question by thinking of kind of the 2 elements of an insurance company. They have the insurance product, and then they have the investment portfolio, which is once they use that policyholder's premium. And so, I mean, on the product side, insurance is the idea that any policyholder can protect his or her idiosyncratic risk by pooling together with a diversified group of people similar to them. And I may be biased here, but that's a great value proposition for policyholders. And, you know, sort of definitionally, insurance is offering people resiliency. It's offering protection. Now, for an insurance company to offer this, they need to orchestrate that those potential claims all won't come due at the same time. And we have an amazing group of actuaries that know how to do that. But insurance providers also really have to offer this trust and longevity to make sure that they are going to be there for their policyholders. So Prudential prides itself on having 140 years of meeting promises. And then on the investment side, you know, similarly, there's that optimization of diversification, but perhaps more interestingly, asset allocation allows for some influence over future conditions. Or said differently, you can actually evaluate not only, you know, the investment risks and performance, but where you place capital, in which projects, in which companies is gonna shape the economy. And Prudential's had an impact investments group since 1976. That's where I work, and you know, now we are managing $1 billion of the insurance company. And probably one of the most visible examples of this, of creating a thriving, not just surviving area is all the investments that we've done since being founded in Newark, New Jersey. We've done everything from kind of revitalizing the downtown to going all the way through the wards, investing in the arts and housing. And I'll leave it there because I know we're on the sprint.
Well, thanks so much, Luke. So I'd like to turn to you now, Camille. So what's the role of the private sector in implementing the BRIC program, and where do you see partnering with your USG colleagues here on the panel as you move forward towards the next opportunity for investments?
So thank you, Chuck, and thank you for the invite. It's really great to follow the FEMA administrator where she mentioned our program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. So that is a grant program, the newest one for FEMA, that offers mitigation to applicants and sub-applicants that are states, locals, tribes, and territories. As she said, we just made a $500 million selection, and we're about to go into our FY21 program, which will be $1 billion, so doubling that investment again. When we were setting up BRIC, we developed guiding principles, and one of those is to promote partnerships, where I think the private sector plays a really vital role. There's a couple of reasons we put that in the program. First is we know that the mitigation needs, the resiliency needs, especially around infrastructure, are larger than any one grant program. So we really want to say through BRIC, how can we start conversations to catalyze actions that everyone can take together? Secondly, we know that as we look at mitigating a lot of those critical facilities and critical infrastructure in communities, those aren't always owned by the public. That is, are actually applicants and sub-applicants. It's owned by the private sector. So we want to make sure that partnership is key, because we definitely need those services to stay on during a disaster, because we know that helps the community recover so much faster. So as I said, the folks that can apply to our program are the states, locals, tribes, and territories, but we absolutely can do projects that are owned by private sector, as well as other private citizens. So we just need to have that partnership. Other ways the private sector can absolutely play is when you look at the technical expertise that potentially private sector has to help communities put together grant applications and implement projects. Or all of our projects have to be cost shared. So there's a non-financial cost share of anywhere from 10 to 25%, typically 25, that potentially private sector can help fund to get these projects into those communities. We also want to reward communities that private sector, as well as other non-governmental entities. So in our competition criteria, we include leveraging partners. We really want, you heard the administrator talk about system-wide approaches to really looking across systems to making sure they're resilient. So we want to make sure there's a whole community approach in these projects that we're able to fund. And then finally, I'll say, we understood when we built the program, our stakeholders felt that partnerships are important, but for a lot of our state, locals, and tribes and territories, they had questions about that. How do I get a partner? How does that work? Where do I go? And so we've actually even added a project type where we can fund partnership work. And so this is something for communities to really help them get some seed money to figure out how to partner with other sectors, including the private sector.
Thanks so much, Camille. I'll turn to you now, Kevin. So I know that HUD has long invested in disaster response, but looking at the opportunities for pre-disaster mitigation, where is HUD investing, and what are opportunities best suited for private sector involvement in your program portfolio?
Great question. So as you pointed out, HUD invests billions of dollars every year in housing, infrastructure, and services in neighborhoods and cities across the US, and with an ever increasing role in aiding communities responding to and recovering from the most devastating disaster. For example, that includes over $67 billion currently under management through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. This has strong rebuilding standards baked in, but we also have 16.2 of that specifically allocated for building resilience to future disasters through the CDBG MIT program. These funds have driven innovation and helped elevate the national conversation on resilient recovery through things like Rebuild by Design and the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And all of this work is done in partnership with the private sector. For example, homes reconstructed in Puerto Rico are being rebuilt to the National Green Building Standard using resilient materials and design along green building elements like on-site solar and natural air ventilation. And on the multifamily side, which involves even more involvement from the private sector, we have grantees like the Virgin Islands Housing Authority breaking ground on a 60-unit affordable multifamily housing that has low-income housing tax credits and CDBG DR to develop an entirely off-grid generating solar energy on site, recycling gray water built to withstand hurricanes, multifamily affordable housing on St. Thomas. And we're also setting an example with innovative, resilient, and catalytic infrastructure investments like the Ohio Creek Watershed Project in Norfolk, Virginia, where we've got a $112 million grant being used to take a hybrid green and gray infrastructure approach to reduce flooding. These investments in infrastructure, as I'm sure this group knows, are so important to economic development and really undergirding the ability to pull in the private sector in so many of these places. It's not just disaster recovery that we're involved in too. We have funding that goes out to 2,100 states and local governments every year for a wide range of community development activities. Some communities can actually use a program called the Section 108 Economic Development Program, which allows grantees to leverage their future block grants to do specifically economic development activities. And that's being used even by small towns at the nexus of resilience and economic development. For example, Mount Vernon, Washington, 35,000 people population, took a $12.9 million Section 108 economic development loan that enabled the revitalization of a nearby commercial area that had been stalled due to flood risk. That loan was used to create a flood wall that protected the downtown, put in a public waterfront park, and really drive economic development to that area. So there's no shortage of work for the private sector to come in alongside our very flexible community development funds.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. So Alejandro, I'll turn to you now. We know that many small businesses don't have contingency plans in place to prepare ahead of the next crisis. What investments do small businesses need to make, and how is SBA helping?
Great, excellent question. So we're out there promoting to small businesses the need to have a disaster preparedness plan. Typically, we present it to them as part of 6 elements. 1, establish a communications plan. 2, protect your documents, which is very easy to do. Make sure that they're, like you can utilize technology, the cloud, just make sure that they're accessible to you. Reviewing your insurance coverage, and not just once, but keeping up with that. Many small businesses will grow over time and might fail to adequately update their insurance coverage as that growth is happening. Create a solid supply chain for the business. COVID was a perfect example of how many businesses were affected by the supply chain and not necessarily by the direct impacts from the virus, meaning they didn't have staff or people who might have been affected. Planning for an alternative location. Another thing that is probably many small businesses need to look at now in a post-COVID era. We saw many businesses that found success when they were able to adapt and go to more of an e-commerce model. So it's not just alternative locations in case you have a closure because of a hurricane or a fire, but also something that just might result in stay-at-home orders. And then the last part, number 6, for those disaster planning steps, is to make sure that you practice and test that plan with the staff. If a business, many of them don't have these plans in place, but even the ones that do, sometimes it just, becomes a plan that gets put on a shelf, gathers dust. We want to make sure that, you're taking it out and you are exercising those plans and your staff is familiar with it. So everybody knows what their role is when something happens. And the last thing I like to mention is, I know we're talking about pre-disaster, but we see repetitive loss in many areas, especially the areas that are very high risk areas for different types of hazards. So SBA has a direct disaster loan program. Part of that program offers property owners, private property owners, mitigation funds at the same low interest rates that they can get to make the repairs. So SBA can provide up to 20% of the total damages that occurred as verified by SBA for that private property owner to do protective measures. So just as an example, if a business had $1 million in disaster damages, they could get up to $200,000 to do protective measures or mitigation to protect themselves against the next disaster that might occur. and they can get that at a really low interest rate. Right now, the interest rates for small businesses is at around 2.88%, I believe. And it's even lower for homeowners. Homeowners have interest rates under 2%. So it's a really great direct federal loan program that helps them do mitigation and protective measures, makes it affordable for them. And this is also important for, different stakeholders in the private sector to know about this program. I've met many companies out there who are doing this really great work about promoting the benefits of doing mitigation. And this is a vehicle that they can use in order to make it more affordable, because that's one of the first obstacles that you run into when you're talking to property owners about doing mitigation is the cost. They're worried about how they're going to pay for it, what are the costs. But your home or your business is probably your best investment that you have. It's so important that you protect it, not just for your financial investments, but you might be protecting your family or your employees. So many great things at SBA. I'd encourage people to go to sba.gov/prepare and look at the content that we have there.
Thanks, Alejandro. That was, I think, a really important place to segue. And Luke, I'd like to, to kind of push that to you. It seems like a repetitive loss program might be something the insurance sector would be interested in. And how have you worked perhaps with SBA to promote that so the assets that you're investing in the risk is reduced?
Yeah, so well, I think, I don't have any direct requests out here for any government agencies. I mean, the best that we can do is become an early participant. And I think we've been able to do that over and over again. We've been in low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credit, opportunity zone investments at the federal level as one of the first institutions. And then I could rifle off a bunch else at the state level. But, reducing risks, I think, starts with, understanding the needs of the community and the business environment. And when I think of resiliency and the idea of being able to absorb, avoid, and recover, I try to give examples of how we've done that, like, absorbing potential climate threats by working closely with recently passed legislation down in Washington, D.C. to reduce stormwater runoff by being part of the green infrastructure that's being built down there, or avoiding harmful events by being that startup capital for firms like Aero Farms, Bright Farms, and Equilibrium, who are designing controlled environment agriculture in our country. And then finally, recovering. I mean, the SBA has done a lot around, giving the small businesses the capital, the working capital that they need. And we've been part of the investor community with community development finance institutions, and just making sure that those PPP programs are being administered, and then also, offering voluntary programs, seeing at the local level what's required to bring retail businesses back as companies like Prudential start to arrive again in central business districts.
Oh, that's perfect. And so, Camille, how can the BRIC program? Luke talked a lot about the investments that they're making. Alejandro mentioned, the way in which they're looking at reducing repetitive loss. How do you see the BRIC program collaborating with both Luke and the private sector, the investments they're making and leveraging those, as well as your fellow USG colleagues?
I think there's a couple of different approaches. One is we talk about this whole community is when the community starts thinking through what their needs are for building resilience, they're looking across all sectors, right? They're looking at their different facilities. They're looking at their neighborhoods. They're looking at future conditions. That's something we care a lot about in the BRIC program, including climate change. But, and then BRIC becomes one of those tools that can be used. As I said, one grant program is not going to solve all the resiliency needs in a community. So it really, I think it's on us to give a lot of technical assistance, provide a lot of guidance to communities who are going to be looking across their needs and then figuring out how to best get it all done. Because these are, whether it's the transportation facilities, the communication, housing, energy resiliency, water needs, these are, it's a multi-faceted need out there that they need to achieve. And so I think BRIC can be a catalyst, can be one element that can help them in achieving their mitigation goals. With CDBG, for example, with HUD, that can be included as match. It loses, when it gets to the state, it loses its federal identity, so it can be used. It can, it's kind of a portfolio management approach, but you could partner the BRIC funds with CDBG funds in getting whole projects done. And one thing I will give a plug to is, as we're rolling out year 2 of BRIC and the $1 billion we're going to make available, we're planning for the month of August. We're actually starting tomorrow with our webinar series. And our first one's going to be on climate change, future conditions, and nature-based solutions, and how those play a role in building community resiliency. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Kevin, given the kind of the broad implications and reach of CDBG and the Section 108 program that you have, these are tools that HUD has that can work with both SBA and FEMA, as well as with the private sector. Kind of what barriers do you see are out there to HUD doing more of what it would like to do? And, how can the private sector help with that?
Well, there are 26 eligible uses of CDBG, as you pointed out. So it's an incredibly flexible program. You can use it to buy land, build infrastructure. You can use it for working capital loans to small businesses. So it's very, very flexible, but united around the common goal of improving low and moderate income individuals and neighborhoods. So I think and it's certainly been used either as the grant itself or as a 108 economic development loan to drive significant economic development. So as the folks on the phone, if you're a business that's only in one location or wherever your anchor location is, encourage you to reach out to your city. It's usually something like a community development department or housing and community development department. Figure out how you can work together to revitalize the neighborhood that your business might be based in or served, or even employ residents from. I think there's no shortage of opportunities to leverage these funds and make good things happen. And particularly when you look at the community development scale, you can think of an economic revitalization strategy, right? You look at efforts, like in Detroit with anchor institutions and other cities with anchor institutions, to go into a community to say, city, what resources do you have to put on the table? Private sector, what resources do you have to put on the table? And how can we have a comprehensive revitalization strategy? And I think as you're doing that, since this is the resilience panel, as you're doing that, how do you not only revitalize the economy in that area, but bake in resilience to future storms, so you're not coming back in 5, 6, 7 years when a disaster inevitably happens and puts you on a new slate again?
That's a great way to end our panel. I'd like to thank our experts once again, and thank the Chamber Foundation. And now we'll turn it back to you. Thanks, everyone.
To all of you on the front lines, thank you. All of us at Dow are grateful for everything you do. Thousands of our colleagues are on the front lines too, staffing our plants and working in our laboratories to support our customers. Our people make the critical products and technologies needed to power our healthcare, hygiene, and medical industries. Our commitment is, and always will be, to ensure the health and well-being of all our colleagues, customers, suppliers, and the global community.
Hi there, I'm Brigadier General Pete Fessler. I'm your moderator for this particular panel. Our topic of discussion today is leadership in crisis and corporate leadership in crisis. And I'm I'm sure each of us have led our organization through crises in the past, but I suspect, like me, that in December of 2019, you had no idea what was in store for you or your company. And I'd like to use your experiences over the last 15 months or so with COVID to get after that broader topic of leadership in crisis. Before I get going, let me do a couple quick introductions of our panel members here. Ms. Claudine Zakowski she's the Global Disaster Relief Coordinator and the Director of Children's Safe Drinking Water Program at Procter & Gamble. We've got Mr. Scotty Blankenship, Senior Director of Procurement at Tyson's Foods, and Mr. Justin Land, Global Citizenship Program Officer and Northeast Public Affairs Manager at the Dow Chemical Company. So to kick this off, I'd like to give each of you a couple minutes to do an introduction beyond what I just did right here. Introduce yourself, talk about your organization a little bit, and then let's have you start off with any introductory remarks that you'd like to make, and then we'll go right into the questions. So Claudine, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Claude Zakowski, and I work in our corporate communications group. I lead our corporate community impact programs in regards to our global disaster relief work, our Children's Safe Drinking Water Program, and in-kind donations.
And Justin?
Hey, thank you so much. I'm Justin Land, a program officer at Dow and our global citizenship team, and I lead our volunteer efforts around the world in addition to our philanthropic response with disaster relief.
Thanks. And Scotty, over to you, please.
Yes, good afternoon and thank you. I'm Scotty Blankenship. I'm with Tyson Foods. I am the Senior Director of Procurement, and I'm responsible for procuring all of our facilities needs for personal protective equipment and such, ensure that we keep our workers safe.
Thanks. So let's move on to the discussion. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a series of questions to each of you. I think that this will be most valuable if we treat this as a discussion. So if there's something during the comments of one of your colleagues that resonates with you or that you'd like to make a comment to follow up on, please feel free to do that. I think it'll make the discussion a lot better if we turn this into a discussion rather than just a hub and spoke question and answer session. So let me kick off with the first question to get things started. I mentioned it before. I'm sure each of you have led your organizations through crises, but COVID certainly challenged all of us. Can you talk about your company's response to COVID and describe how this response differed from the way you or your organization has responded to crises in the past? So I'll start off, Claude, with you, and then we'll just go from there.
Thanks. So yeah, I've been working in the disaster relief area for some time and would say that I feel like we had a pretty good handle on being prepared and had the right protocols, but COVID, I think for all of us, is certainly a game changer in that respect. And I think quickly we had to establish some new core principles for the company and how we were going to approach our overall response. And we did that, and we continue to use these core principles today. So they're quite simple. One is protecting our P&G people around the world, serving consumers, and supporting communities. And I think everybody will agree. The first priority for any company is really ensuring the health and well-being of our people. And although many of us could work virtually, those in our manufacturing facilities around the world obviously could not. So we had to quickly establish the right safety protocols, ensure we had PPE and rigorous cleaning procedures and so on. For those of us in the virtual world, it was establishing new network and collaboration tools and capabilities. And then the company thought through new enhanced benefits for a virtual world, wellness resources, offered free COVID testing for employees, virtual doctor visits, and so on. The second, in terms of serving consumers, many of our products, such as toilet paper, obviously were in short supply. And so that meant, ramping up to 24/7 operations so that we really could serve our consumers by ensuring that they had access to, the health, hygiene, and cleaning products that people were relying on in COVID more than ever. And so it's a testament to our product supply organization that they were able to really step up and overcome a lot of the challenges that were occurring throughout the pandemic. And lastly, supporting communities. We have a long history of supporting communities in need. It's a foundation of our company. It's an area I feel very privileged to get to work on every day. And we did that by really focusing on frontline workers and those most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And our response included, monetary grants, PPE supplies, product donations by more than 50 brands in over 55 countries in collaboration with more than 200 relief organizations.
Thank you. Justin, let's go over to you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what's unique about COVID is, you mentioned what started in December 2019. It really seems like that distant memory, but as it became the global pandemic, COVID became a connector like no other disaster that I've seen. It truly impacted every single Dow community, every single Dow site, every single employee, but also our customers and our businesses became connected because of this global pandemic, and still very much so connected. And so, there's two big things that we have seen with COVID that I would say is actually consistent with other disasters. One is just our employee base, how strong they are in wanting to help solve problems, whether local problems, whether they're global in nature, in our labs, or in our communities. And so this team of employees, we have about 36,000 employees around the world. This connection point brought together our businesses and geographies and communities in really new ways that we've never seen before in other disasters. The other is just that focus and perseverance of wanting to be resilient to solve. And so some of the things mentioned earlier that I would say is somewhat consistent with us at Dow as well. First was the importance of safety and business continuity. That number one priority every single day is safety. If we run safely, then we shouldn't be running at all. And so that's been the core point in any disaster that we've seen, but very strong here. The other is really figuring out, how do we operate safely? And so we developed some corporate standards that are science-based to ensure that we're able to operate when appropriate. And we have shared our return to workplace playbook externally. And so this is available for anybody to download on our website. But then the other pieces is that we do play a very critical role in delivering solutions that are needed in this pandemic, from medical equipment and infrastructure, medical supplies and PPE, and that personal and home hygiene and sanitation pieces as well. And so the raw materials that we manufacture are critical to many suppliers and customers around the world. And then the last piece, and I think there's probably not a company out there that wouldn't say this, is that support of local and global communities. And so we've seen this on a small scale or large scale disaster standpoint, but we've had to be agile. We've had to learn in new ways of what emerging needs are. I mean, we recently have really gone on a deep dive around mental health. And this is not a space that we focused on historically. And so we've had to meet new partners, invest in areas that are very needed right now. And so, it's been an interesting time and it's not over, but I think the muscle memory that we've gained over the course of time has been very helpful.
Thank you, Scotty. How about at Tyson's?
Yep. So very similar to my esteemed panelists here, Tyson recognized early on that COVID was going to have a major impact to our supply chain. And, in the world of food production, that it's critical to get those pounds of meat and other products to the consumers. And so we put together a very concerted plan to ensure that our our plants would not be interrupted, yet our workers would be safe. And so we immediately created a task force early January and began communicating with the various government agencies, including the CDC and USDA, OSHA, and others. We wanted to understand what it was going to take to keep our plants open through proper sanitation methods, increase personal protective equipment. We knew we had to get product here to the U.S. quickly. We chartered multiple jets to move PPE from China and other countries to the U.S. quickly so that we could keep our lines up and running. And we worked very closely with the many government agencies such as DOT to help them understand the need for keeping places open to service our truck drivers as they move product, animal feeds, et cetera. And most importantly, we saw a very significant impact to the production of cryogen, CO2 specifically, which is a byproduct of ethanol production. As we saw the demand for gasoline fall, we worked actively with various government agencies to ensure that we kept facilities up and running so that we could produce food. We worked very closely with each plant and community to ensure that our workers felt safe and good about going into various facilities, and put together a very generous bonus program to ensure these essential workers knew that their work was appreciated.
Thanks. In all three of your comments, I noticed that taking care of your workforce was top of it, and how you responded to ensure you were still delivering your goods to obviously a needing public. Claude, you were the only one that mentioned you felt that your organization was prepared. I'd like to dig into that a little bit. Are there things that you, looking back now in retrospect, that you believe you could do differently to better prepare your organizations for some type of an event like this in the future? And Justin, I'll go back to you to start this one off.
So that's a tricky one of the preparedness side. And, I think with Dow, a lot of our work is we need our facilities for the manufacturing side of manufacturing what we send to our customers, the supply chain side of things, and then just the innovation side, really needing the R&D capabilities within our labs. And so very early on, we really worked with local governments to ensure that the industry was part of the critical infrastructure to be able to make sure that employees could continue to deliver safely. But also we had a significant amount of workforce, including myself, that very quickly relocated to home offices or quickly setting up home offices. And so, as we've gone on, I would say over the past 15, 16, 17 months, there's been much greater emphasis on the well-being side of things and really making sure that employees are taken care of. And so it goes back, I think, to the muscle memory of how you connect with employees on a day-to-day basis. And so at Dow, we invested a lot on communication and transparency around our return to work playbook, and then also just on the well-being side. And so I think the more you can build in some of these mechanisms to connect with employees, to engage with them, but also empower employees as well, and especially the leaders that support a lot of employees out there, is helpful in the long run.
Thanks, Scotty. How about back over to you?
Yes,
things to do to prepare ahead of time.
Yeah, we definitely had some learnings. I think the biggest thing that we've come to realize is this, much like much of the world, moving to a just-in-time supply chain and delivery system really exposes the gaps when you have a black swan event such as this pandemic. And so we have made some significant changes in our inventory management practices, especially when you are sourcing goods or materials globally, and that there's could be significant impact to shipping times due to ocean freight, containers, other things that may be disrupted by various events. So Tyson has made a concerted effort to identify what are those key raw materials and goods that are required to run our facilities to keep our team members safe, and that we have built significant inventory stateside that is easily accessible, that we can move quickly about the country to take care of any potential needs.
Thanks. Claude, you were the only one that mentioned feeling like you were prepared ahead of time. Anything that your company would change on the looking back?
Well, I think similar to what Scotty and Justin said, there's always lots to be learned and things that you will change going forward. But I feel like fundamentally one of our, the strongest things we had in place going into COVID were our partnerships with our public-private, and that really was the foundation of all that we did. We had those long-established partners that we could talk to, that we could work together with to really respond the most efficiently and get aid where it was needed the most. And building on what Justin had said about people, one of the things is when you give people a challenge, they will often rise to that challenge. As I'm sure many experienced, there were shortages of PPE and very difficult to get a hold of that, which is critical to safety and so many other things. We leveraged our internal capabilities of our R&D, engineering, manufacturing folks, and put the challenge in front of them. Can we manufacture our own face masks? Can we produce hand sanitizer and face shields? And people stepped up. They found plans for how to do things. They retrofitted modified equipment. They got lines up and running in record time to be able to produce those types of supplies, which we could use both internally as well as donate to, healthcare facilities and frontline workers.
Thanks, Scotty. I'm going to come back to you on a different topic. You mentioned the lessons you learned with respect to supply chain, and I think that's a common theme in all of your answers, the challenges associated with that. I've heard in my career the quote over and over again, never waste a crisis, meaning there's always something that you can learn out of the situation. So, and even in the worst of times, at NORAD and US Northcom, we found that the lessons we learned from COVID had a broader applicability to the full range of things, military and non-military activities that we're responsible for. So, Scotty, I'd like to start with you and ask that question. What lessons did you learn from COVID that you can more broadly apply across the full range of potential crises that you see, including that Black Swan event that you talked about?
Yes, absolutely. And the biggest thing is definitely involving supply chain, quick response time, the ability to basically move mountains overnight, and that's what we had to do. I heard Justin talk about muscle memory and the things that we learned and did during COVID. Absolutely would apply in future events. It's funny, this past year, not long after we're just beginning to recover from COVID, we had Winter Storm Uri that hit Texas. Definitely impacted our supply chain in a big way. But we had already had some very significant learnings from COVID about moving to various other suppliers, looking at the global supply chain. We had found various ways to move goods across the country. And so we applied those. And again, as I mentioned earlier, inventory, while in today's society in the just-in-time environment, inventory is often looked at as your money tied up in an asset. We have found that it's also a good way to mitigate risk in certain situations. So those critical items that you're going to need every day to open a facility, those are items that we look at having on hand in some spot that we can move quickly across the country and service our facilities.
Thanks, Justin. Let's go back to you.
So, I think for me, there's probably three key learnings. And the first is the importance of team. This is a fundamental principle within emergency management of making sure that the right stakeholders are at the table. And I think COVID really showed how important this was at Dow, especially because of the scale. Bringing together the functions, our businesses, but geographies really showed how important that communication was to not just benefit our customers and help our customers, but going back to the employee piece as well, and making sure that dialogue was happening. The other is around the importance of providing that global vision and what the company stands for that can be applied locally. And so as we've seen with COVID, I'd say more and more today, as we look at returning back to the office, it's going to look a little bit different everywhere because of the local guidance that exists, the data that exists as well. But if we're able to provide that pathway, it gives us something that we can all strive for. And I think a huge testament to Dow for a lot of the investment that we made early on in setting this vision forward. And then the last piece, and Scotty, I think you kind of mentioned this as well, is just around the agility side of things. And having that right team, you can move a lot faster than you might on a given day. And I think with COVID, we've been able to do things and broker new partnerships, if you will, or connect with customers in new ways because of how agile we've been able to be during COVID. So a lot of lessons learned, and and still a lot of work to do.
Those are great points. Ma'am, over to you. Last words on that topic.
I think similar to what Scotty and Justin said. I mean, some of the key lessons, I think having the right leadership in place and really setting for the core principles and how the company is going to frame our response helped guide us the whole way through. It was very clear what everybody was working towards and what our priorities were. I think communication, clarity of communication, both internally with our employees. We had, an incredible group that was continually keeping everybody updated on what was going on, what the company could do, and how we were supporting communities around us. And I think capability, the internal capability of our organization, we can't underestimate what brands are able to do, utilizing our marketing expertise and advertising for public health messaging and so on. We were able to tap into so many things that we hadn't previously used during other disasters. I think to really make some important and meaningful impacts, both in the public health arena as well as supporting, international relief aid efforts.
Well, let me dig down on something that you talked about there, and I'll come right back to you for the answer on that. You said having the right leaders in place to be able to respond. That means individual leadership. So I suspect we all led in ways that we never really imagined. I think that the quote of 2020 will likely be, "Sorry, I was on mute." Leading by Zoom or leading by Teams is a challenge. Can you talk a little bit about how your leadership style changed, or the leadership styles of those that you work with changed to deal with COVID and the unique challenges associated with that?
Yeah, I think agility is the key word, and being able to adapt to situations, not being able to be in the same room with people, and yet, needing to be connected globally, with other parts, other countries, and partners around the world. So it requires a lot of agility, and it's been a great learning experience. I take what I've learned and I try to do the best I can moving forward to be prepared and be ready when something else like this comes along, which I hope it never does.
I hear you. Scotty, how about you?
Yeah, when I look at leadership, I look at what Tyson did as a company, and they put feeding America first and team member safety ahead of profitability. They did what it took. We went through some extraordinary circumstances and costs in order to outfit our plants quickly to meet the demand. All again to make sure that Americans had access to food, while keeping team member safety as the number one aspect of that.
Justin?
Very similar to Scotty here on the safety side, that has remained the number one priority. And we're very vocal about that internally, but also externally as well, but also the role that we can play in the world and with our customers and the products that Dow Innovation goes into. And so we've really worked hard at all of that. We've run fast, probably failed faster, but kept moving the ship to work, with our communities and with our customers as a whole.
Thanks. I'm showing us with about 2.5 minutes left here, and I don't want to leave dead time. So I'm going to pick, Claude, one last one for you.
Yeah.
And that is, this has been a national tragedy, obviously. It's been a global tragedy. 4.2 million dead around the world, 620,000 dead in the US. But even in these times, there are things that are silver linings. There's little things. Maybe it's more family time. Maybe it's expanded options for at-home work. Maybe it's a better understanding of the global challenges. I'll give you about a minute to answer what you see as those silver linings, the things that we can take away from this, and maybe end this on a positive note.
Well, when we turn the page on 2020 into 2021, we launched a campaign called Lead with Love. And as a company, we committed to doing 2021 acts of good in 2021. And this campaign was all about looking at the positive. And it was a call to action for all of us to come together, to do more and do better for our community, for each other, for the planet. And I really think this campaign exemplifies, what we're trying to do as a company and what we all hope for the future, which is that we can overcome this past year, and that we can demonstrate by these acts of good that there is a lot of positive in the world, and there is a lot of hope.
Thank you. So in the last minute here, I wanted to mention a key takeaway I heard from each of you. I'm struck by the similarities of your corporate challenges with leadership and your corporate response to the crises and what we face in the Department of Defense challenge here at NORAD and U.S. Northern Command. The challenges are the same: taking care of our people and making sure that our no-fail missions, or in your case, your no-fail products, get delivered to the consumers. On behalf of everybody that's dialed in right now, I think I'm safe in saying we're smarter for having listened to you. We didn't have to learn all these lessons ourselves. We can take advantage of the things that you brought to this. I'd like to say thank you very much, and I'll be a better leader for having listened to you. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Roberti, and I'm pleased to welcome our next speaker. Lieutenant General A.C. Roper serves as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Northern Command and the Vice Commander of the U.S. Element at North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. From his position at Peterson Air Force Base outside of Colorado Springs, General Roper assists the commander of U.S. NORTHCOM and NORAD in anticipating, preparing for, and responding to threats against North America and within Northern Command's assigned area of responsibility. General Roper also provides oversight of Northern Command's mission to provide defense support to civil authorities. General Roper has 35 years of distinguished service in the U.S. Army in active and reserve capacities and has completed several overseas deployments. If you take a look at his bio, it's extremely impressive. I would encourage you to read it. If I were to do it, it would take another 5 minutes. But in addition to his Army service, he also served as a police officer for 33 years and retired in 2017 as chief of the Birmingham Police Department in Birmingham, Alabama. General Roper has been able to apply key lessons learned from his time leading both the Army Reserve and Birmingham Police Department. He led the Army Reserve Command that provides trained and ready units to respond to homeland emergencies and support the American people. A few years ago, when significant tornadoes struck Alabama, then Chief Roper understood the coordination required to synchronize civilian response and recovery efforts, as well as the importance of partnerships and relationships to mission success. General Roper's unique law enforcement perspective is particularly valuable in his position as Deputy Commander at U.S. Northern Command, where support to civil authorities is a key priority. The pandemic, significant natural disasters, and rapid technological changes have changed the North American security environment, and our adversaries have adapted and advanced their capabilities in all domains to challenge us at home. These adversaries are exploiting perceived cyber or societal or social or political vulnerabilities for their benefit, and where possible, are holding at risk our people, our critical infrastructure, and our ability to project power. These facts underscore the command's challenges as it looks to integrate new capabilities, adopt forward-looking approaches, and adjust how it operates to succeed in its mission. Lieutenant General Roper's remarks today will set the stage for the combatant commander's keynote remarks on Homeland Defense tomorrow. I look forward to hearing his perspective on the role the private sector plays in advancing the U.S. Northern Command's Homeland Defense mission and what effective public-private partnerships look like from his point of view. Lieutenant General Roper, welcome and good afternoon. The floor is yours.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation and to FEMA for hosting this vitally important conference and allowing me to share my thoughts at this forum. It is my great pleasure to represent the North American Aerospace Defense Command and the United States Northern Command today. These commands, while distinct, share a single no-fail mission: defend our homeland. The soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Space Force Guardians, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians at NORAD and U.S. NORTHCOM come to work each day dedicated to this singular mission. But we cannot defend our homeland alone. It takes a collective effort for people like those in attendance today, from our interagency partners at the federal, state, and local levels, and from the private sector. To me, Homeland Defense and Homeland Security are intertwined. You cannot have Homeland Security without hometown security. And that's one thing I've learned from 33 years as a police officer. And as Chris mentioned, a decade as the chief of police in Birmingham, Alabama. It's people like you and the organizations you represent that serve as the first line of our nation's security. But before I go any further, let me quickly paint you a picture of our current strategic environment. We live in an era of great power competition. China's ambition to become a world power has emboldened their military expansion and global influence, both economically and through statecraft. And they view the United States as the principal obstacle standing in the way of their desired end state. Russia strives to reassert itself as a world power and looks to exploit the full spectrum of options, both kinetic and non-kinetic, to achieve its goals. We've seen Russia increasingly leverage asymmetric strategies like meddling in our internal civil affairs to create instability in our own backyard. Additionally, Iran and North Korea continue to advance their ability to target the homeland as a top priority in order to preserve their own regimes. And we must still be vigilant to the threats posed by violent extremist organizations, threats like the one we experienced on 9/11. So how do we accomplish the no-fail mission of defending our homelands from these threats? We need to recognize that today's security environment is not as simple as two military forces trading blows in a war of attrition. Instead, our adversaries will target our homeland through the cyber realm, our infrastructure. They'll look to divide us through social media, sow discord through civil unrest. They will target our very way of life. They'll muddy the waters, try to complicate things within our communities so we're unwilling or unable to fight. So here is the bottom line. We need to acknowledge that the homeland is no longer a sanctuary from our adversaries. You're likely familiar with U.S. Northern Command's Defense Support to Civil Authorities mission, commonly referred to as DSCA. From hurricane response, to forest fires and other natural disasters, to supporting our nation's COVID-19 response efforts. We consider this mission fundamentally as defending our homeland, not the kind you may picture when you think of the traditional military mission, but just as vital. The Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack was a great example of malign cyber activity that had major impacts. And you can imagine the potential these types of attacks could have if applied at scale. These kinds of emergencies, whether natural or man-made, they threaten the homeland. And so we look at them with the same degree of urgency that we do with traditional military threats. So the primary message that I like to convey aligns exactly with the purpose of this conference. That is, we have to think about disaster response and recovery through a whole of nation approach. Whether it's a nation state or a natural disaster, threats to our homeland don't concern themselves with lanes of responsibility and the gaps and seams that these create. In fact, those seams are exactly what our adversaries will look to exploit. So I believe it's critically important that the private and public sectors, our military, our federal, state and local government agencies, and our private and other NGOs strive to synchronize our resiliency efforts through our planning, through our operations, through exercises, our innovative efforts, sharing our lessons learned, and our strategic messaging, that we continue to work those seams that I mentioned and improve the way that our private and public sectors communicate and collaborate. So here's one quick example of what I'm talking about. U.S. NORTHCOM actively participates with the Interagency Coordination Center. And last year during Hurricane Sally, we had a great session and continuing efforts of crosstalk with the American Red Cross with regards to sheltering people displaced from the storm. The ICC enabled the military and the Red Cross to synchronize our efforts instead of duplicating them. A small win, but a great case study in how we can work together to help the American people during crisis. The ability to clearly see the whole playing field during a disaster, like we did during Hurricane Sally, is what we call in the military all domain awareness. And we at NORAD and US NORTHCOM consider all domain awareness to be a key strategic principle to defending our homeland. There are challenges to this, obviously. When we look at natural disaster response, just the sheer number of agencies that have responsibilities and equities. It's so easy for information to get stovepiped unless we really work on the processes to prevent it. That's easier to say than to do. Today, we're saturated with data coming from everywhere, from satellites, our airborne sensors, open source feeds, even Twitter and other social media. And this is the challenge that NORAD and US Northern Command face on a daily basis, trying to build that all domain awareness with our partners. So 2 years ago, we decided to partner with industry to enhance our all domain awareness capabilities through something we call GIDE, G-I-D-E, which means Global Information Dominance Experiments. We saw how much the private sector was investing in new technologies, particularly involving data. And we wanted to leverage those capabilities and that experience. In many ways, we needed to learn from the private sector to onboard that culture of moving fast when it comes to innovation. When COVID hit us last year, we shifted our GIDE efforts to enhance the military support to medical response operations. Working with our industry partners, we rapidly evolved our domain awareness tools. We think this helped us to provide more timely support to the American people. And we also took some great lessons from the experience. I'm happy to report that we just wrapped up our third iteration of GIDE just a couple of weeks ago. And I had the opportunity to watch this firsthand from our operations center. It was so impressive to see our combined military, interagency, and private industrial teams working side by side, taking massive amounts of data, streaming in from across the globe, and making sense of it with AI, with machine learning algorithms to help our leaders make timely, informed decisions in defense of our homeland. We're already planning our next iteration of GUIDE, and I can tell you that the Department of Defense is fully on board with how fast we're moving, particularly with our private sector partners. I bring this up because this is exactly where we can take this same philosophy, how those of us here today can think about all domain awareness and how we can better support the American people by closing those gaps and seams I mentioned and moving fast to get there. We cannot be afraid to fail. In fact, we should expect to fail when we move fast. We should be afraid of moving too slow. So we need to be faster than the threats we face. So whether that threat is a hurricane off the coast of Florida, or wildfire in California, or an adversarial attack on our power grids, supply chains, or banking systems, we can take what we've learned from COVID and other disaster response efforts to learn and adapt. Apply these lessons in our exercises, our combined planning efforts, our collaborative innovation efforts, so we strengthen our nation's resiliency through these partnerships. That's the challenge we've issued ourselves here at NORAD and U.S. Northern Command. And that's also the challenge we have in this very forum, to work together to be ready when crisis comes. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today, and thank you for your time. We look forward to working with our interagency partners at FEMA, with DHS, and with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as we continue this no-fail mission of defending our homelands. So on behalf of the men and women at Northern American Aerospace Defense Command, better known as NORAD, and U.S. Northern Command, the bottom line is we have the watch. Thank you so much.
Welcome. My name is Melissa Broats, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I'm Vice President of Global Marketing and External Affairs at Abbott, where I oversee Abbott's sustainability and community partnership strategies. I'm also president of Abbott's foundation, the Abbott Fund. Our panel today will be talking about two of the greatest challenges of our time, the rise in displaced communities and the growing impact of chronic diseases, also called non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. Just last month, the UN released a report showing the number of displaced people rose to 82 million in 2020, with this number expected to rise to over 100 million in the coming years. Issues like poverty, food insecurity, climate change, conflict, and of course, global pandemics like COVID-19 are increasingly interconnected and driving more people to search for safety and security. While we've all been focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, persistent health problems like diabetes and heart disease continue to take an outsized toll, accounting for nearly 3 out of 4 deaths. And NCDs are also one of the greatest risk factors for severe COVID-19. Many may think that NCDs are primarily a challenge of advanced economies, but our panel will share some numbers to dispel that notion. The intersection of these two crises, chronic disease in displaced populations, has long been an overlooked and underfunded area of need. Our panel is going to shine a spotlight on these issues and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities to address them. But before we dive in, I'd like to welcome each of our guest speakers. First, I'm excited to be joined by Gloria Steele, the Chief Operating Officer of the global humanitarian organization CARE. Most recently, Gloria served as acting administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development earlier this year, and previously as Deputy Assistant Administrator, where she led USAID's Bureau for Asia for the past 4 years. She also previously served as Mission Director for the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, and Mongolia, and a Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Global Health. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Nugent, who is Vice President at RTI International, a nonprofit research institute dedicated to addressing the world's most critical problems with science-based solutions. Rachel also serves as Director of RTI's Center for Global Non-Communicable Diseases. With more than 30 years of experience in global development, she leads a team focused on cost-effective strategies to prevent and control global NCDs. Finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Angela Wakwea, who is Senior Director of Health, Equity, and Rights at CARE. Dr. Angela has over 20 years of experience in public health program development, management, and monitoring. This includes expertise in disease epidemiology, prevention and care services. Dr. Angela has served in leadership positions across sectors at both government public health departments and nonprofit organizations globally. Welcome to our panelists. We're going to jump right in. Gloria, we know CARE is closely engaged in addressing key needs for displaced communities globally. And in your prior role at USAID, you were involved in these areas as well. Can you kick us off with context on this growing and devastating impact of humanitarian crises around the world? What are some of the impacts in terms of health and other key needs?
Thank you, Melissa. That's a great question to kick off our panel discussion today. Let me start by saying that in 2020, 168 million people needed humanitarian assistance, a number that has significantly grown over the last decade. In this unprecedented year, we launched our largest humanitarian response since the founding of CARE in the aftermath of the Second World War, delivering life-saving assistance to over 92 million individuals across over 100 countries. At the end of 2020, the United Nations estimated that at least 235 million people will need humanitarian assistance in 2021, a very big increase from the previous year. This translates into one person for every 33 people worldwide being caught up in a humanitarian crisis, a significant increase from one in every 45 people in 2020. In addition to affecting significantly more people, UN data also shows that the average length of humanitarian crisis today has almost doubled over the last 5 years. As of 2019, for example, the average humanitarian crisis lasted for over 9 years. Crisis situations around the world has also become increasingly complex, rendering the delivery of humanitarian aid more challenging because of complicated socioeconomic environments, the diversity of affected groups, inequities, violence, or other societal and geopolitical factors. Today, humanitarian crises are triggered by many more factors than in the past. First factor is conflict. The number of people forcibly displaced because of conflicts has significantly increased over time, exacerbating gender inequalities and gender-based violence. The second factor includes natural disasters and climate change, which have affected 350 million people on average each year and have cost billions of dollars in damages. Third is food insecurity. Between 2015 and 2017, the number of people who experienced crisis-level food insecurity or worse rose from 80 million to 124 million. And then, of course, we have the health crisis, such as Ebola and COVID-19. Speaking of COVID-19, the health and second-order impacts of COVID-19, coupled with the growing impacts of climate change, have increased the number of people in need by 40%, the single largest increase ever recorded in 1 year. This historic level is challenged by a decrease in bilateral aid as donor governments attended to the economic and the social fallout of COVID-19 in their own countries. Indeed, as of December 20th, 2020, the UN reported that the humanitarian response plans and appeals for the past year were funded only at approximately 45% of the need, which is less than half of the appeals. COVID-19 has highlighted some of the worst impacts of humanitarian crisis, such as significant loss of lives, reduced access to healthcare, reduced access to education and other social services, loss of livelihood and shelter, gender-based violence and human trafficking, food insecurity, and a significant downturn in economic growth in every country around the world. Over back to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Gloria. Those numbers are really sobering. Rachel, let's turn to you. Given your expertise in non-communicable diseases, can you talk about the growing devastation of NCDs globally, and what are some of the factors that make NCDs especially challenging for displaced communities?
Yes, thanks, Melissa. And thank you to the Chamber and the Chamber Foundation for this opportunity to speak about this topic. NCDs in low resource settings and fragile settings are my passion. And I think it's so important that people realize the extent of this issue. You mentioned some of the big picture numbers. 3 out of 4 deaths in the world every year are from these NCDs. What are NCDs? Sometimes the terminology we use is inside baseball. It's diabetes, it's heart disease, it's cancer, hypertension. People all over the world are dying from these NCDs. 80% of those deaths are in low resource settings. So the vast majority of deaths are from NCDs. And that's a good story in one way, in that people live longer. They're not dying from childhood diseases as much. And so that's a success. But what's not a success is that so many of these deaths that occur in low resource settings happen prematurely. That is, people often in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that are dying, which as an economist that I am, I often look at things with that economic lens. It means a loss of productivity, a loss of GDP in those countries. So for instance, the chances of dying below age 70 in Haiti are 31% of dying from an NCD compared to the chances of dying from an NCD below age 70, 14% in the US. And all of our attention right now is focused on Haiti. And you can imagine the tragedy of people dying in the prime of their life with such a high probability. So what does that mean in those settings, particularly the settings, the fragile settings of displaced populations? It means impoverishment. It means that people are spending more than twice as much for healthcare on average as people who don't have an NCD in their family. That is, people whose families have just one person living with an NCD are spending much more on their healthcare than people who don't have that within their family. And it often also means lack of continuity of care. So if there is access to care, which is a big question, there's difficulty in getting continuity of care and any management over time. And how that is different from, say, malaria or other infectious diseases is that people need continuity of care. If they're going to be screened and diagnosed and have their diseases managed, so they don't have a sudden heart attack, they need to be able to see a clinician, to see the healthcare worker on a regular basis. So those are some of the differences in people who are displaced or in fragile settings, but experiencing these same diseases that we experience everywhere else in the world. Back over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Rachel. What you described is something we saw firsthand in our work responding to disasters. The global community has strong models to address immediate needs for food, water, shelter, and emergency care. But this idea of prevention and ongoing care of NCDs in these settings, as we've said, is not and has not been an area of focus. So that's why we reached out to CARE in 2018 to look more closely at this issue and to see how we could collaborate. We knew CARE had unique capabilities in empowering women, mobilizing communities, and strengthening systems. And that matched up well with our own expertise in health and health technology for NCDs. We found out more about CARE's work in the Philippines, particularly in the southern city of Marawi, where armed conflict between government forces and militant groups back in 2017 displaced about 350,000 people from their homes. So Abbott and the Abbott Fund forged a partnership with CARE to find the best way to help, with an eye toward measuring and then sharing results and creating a model that could be scaled elsewhere. In a moment, I'm going to ask Dr. Angela to walk us through this important work. But first, We'd like to share a very brief video, less than a minute, that provides an introduction to this program.
During the Marawi siege, 350,000 people were displaced.
Many health facilities were destroyed, and therefore the health services to the people were disrupted.
In the middle of 2019, CARE and Abbott partnered with our office to address the growing concern for non-communicable diseases.
Nabid no ba malakam ya kalalad namin ni Yugop gito. As I've said last na, so di piki-examine na sakya kumbinsa meron, sakya pa ka maaabot, tapos.
Now back to our guests. Dr. Angela, can you walk us through the program in the Philippines and the results you're seeing on the ground?
The Philippines is the third most disaster-prone country in the world. It's exposed and extremely vulnerable to natural hazards. At the same time, the island of Mindanao, where Marawi is located, has a long history of protracted and recurring conflict. 8% of adult Filipinos have diabetes. 18% have high blood pressure. 36% are overweight or obese, and 1 in 5 are smokers. In 2017, a 5-month-long conflict between government forces and militant groups forced more than 350,000 residents of Marawi and neighboring towns to flee. 2 years later, 70,000 to 100,000 plus people remain displaced from Marawi and surrounding areas. And together with Abbott, CARE put forward a program. It's actually quite unique, and this is how it works. We work with community health workers who conduct screenings to identify people with non-communicable diseases, that is diabetes and hypertension, and those at risk of developing these chronic diseases. The women would then be identified and trained to lead what are known as non-communicable disease clubs to advance disease prevention and management. The community health workers would then monitor levels of blood pressure, A1Cs, as well as blood sugar regularly, and then refer patients who need medical attention or medication to the facilities that exist. At the same time, the clinical care within the camps where the residents were had expanded access to the individuals who are suffering from diabetes and hypertension. And therefore, we worked to strengthen the local healthcare system to meet the increased demand. And at the same time, we worked with local stakeholders to educate individuals on the prevention and control of non-communicable diseases from the community to the national government level. You asked what have been some of the key results to date. It has been actually quite astounding. We found that there has been an increase in the percentage of hypertensive members with controlled blood pressure. We also found that there has been a decrease in systolic pressure for many of those who are suffering from hypertension. We also found that there's increased number of diabetic members with controlled blood sugar. And then lastly, a decrease in fasting blood glucose levels for some of the members. These results have been actually astounding, and we have been incredibly impressed by them.
Thank you, Dr. Angela. This model of care empowers women. And Gloria, you mentioned that women are often disproportionately affected by these crises. And it helps position them as leaders of change throughout the process. Gloria, can you talk a bit about the challenges that women are facing and why it's so important to empower them to lead?
Thank you for this question, Melissa. As we all know, as I have said previously, disasters and humanitarian crises disproportionately affect women. For example, when food is short, women and girls eat last and the least. They are also more likely to miss out on education. They are at a much greater risk of sexual violence and human trafficking. They are often the first to lose their jobs and livelihoods. They often have less access to life-saving health services, and they often take on even more responsibilities as caregivers, not just for their own families, but for others too. Most women affected by crisis often have little or no influence over decisions that largely negatively affect them. At the same time, I will note that women should not only be viewed as victims of conflict and instability. Historically, they have shown great strength and resilience and have played a strong role as human rights leaders and active agents in both formal and informal peace building and recovery processes. Thus, in all of CARE's programs, we prioritize supporting women as leaders and advocates in addressing the impacts of development and humanitarian challenges that face them, their households, and their communities. Let me end by talking about CARE's Women Lead in Emergencies Toolkit, which we use to support local women's groups to take the lead in responding to crises that affect them and their communities. This toolkit has been piloted in Colombia, Niger, Mali, the Philippines, Tonga, and in Uganda. And for instance, in Uganda, we have seen that the application of the toolkit increased women's confidence in their negotiation and communication skills by 91%, and it improved their ability to work with other women to achieve their goals from 30 to 92%. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Dr. Angela, can you share some of the other key success factors of the program in the Philippines, such as the roles of community and local officials in driving the program, and how you're addressing the challenges of making this impact that Gloria described more sustainable?
This program is unique for 6 reasons. The first is a focus on non-communicable diseases in emergency settings, which is aligned with recent efforts to prioritize chronic diseases in communities affected by emergencies, an area that is not a priority across the globe. The second reason why the program is unique is that it is among the first of its kind to evaluate the burden of non-communicable diseases in internally displaced populations in Southeast Asia. Again, the growing burden of non-communicable diseases in Southeast Asia makes this program unique. The third is that there is a dearth of data. There's not enough data surrounding the health status of home-based internally displaced persons, and this project will contribute to that evidence base. The fourth reason is that this project includes younger populations. Those are individuals under the age of 40 due to the high burden of non-communicable diseases among Filipinos in this age band. The fifth reason is that this is the first program to employ WHO's STEPS survey in the Philippines, which surveys the population to determine how they're responding to non-communicable disease management. And then lastly, the sixth is that it integrates technology to facilitate health screenings and tracking of program results. Again, technology will be a key factor going forward in terms of management of disease, and this is an area that CARE is leaning into. You asked what are the elements that might make this program sustainable going forward, especially working with national stakeholders, especially the public healthcare system. This program is unique because of 4 elements that work together. The first is the fact that it works with community health workers who live within the internally displaced camps and where the population who is suffering from non-communicable diseases lives, works, plays, and manages their lives. And as Gloria mentioned at the very top, the majority of community health workers are women. So this is an opportunity to empower women and give them greater respect in the community. So in that sense, this model has that key unique element that makes it work very well. The second is that the individuals who have non-communicable diseases are part of what is known as an NCD club. This club fosters unity. It also fosters an ability to have a social group where people who are suffering from non-communicable diseases can get together and manage their disease together. The third unique element is the connection to the formal healthcare system. This is not a standalone project. It is interwoven and interconnected with the existing public healthcare system. And that particular element augurs well for sustainability in the future, so that when this project leaves, it is part of the system that will continue after it ends. And then the fourth and final element that makes this model unique is that it brings advocacy for greater attention to non-communicable diseases in emergency settings. Again, an area that has been ignored in public health globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Angela. Some good progress there. We've heard a lot about the Philippines, but Rachel, what are you seeing elsewhere in terms of what's working for NCD care? And what do you think it's going to take to make NCD prevention and care a bigger priority in the global community?
Thanks, Melissa. Great questions. Let me just pick up on a few of the points that Dr. Angela made, because they do apply very broadly to the needs of communities and people living with NCDs. One is the issue of data. We really don't have great data about the prevalence and incidence of NCDs, particularly for poor and marginalized people and people who may be IDPs, maybe in fragile settings. So registration, the legal status of people, the ability to be registered and then found and identified, that's really important. And having a STEP survey among this population is just an incredible advance, because STEP surveys tell us so much about what the needs of people are and what the health system is able to provide. Once that's in place, once people are found and identified, a few of the things that we've seen that work definitely apply for these populations, but also more broadly. One is task shifting, where possible, from doctors to nurses to community health workers. And much of this care, the screening and ongoing management of a chronic disease can be done by lower cadres of the health system more cheaply and more accessibly. So people will have more access. We can achieve a broader coverage when we're task shifting. It'll take decades to have enough specialists in so many of these settings, and we don't need to do everything with specialists. A second point here is, and we really learned this lesson during COVID, is to try to minimize the burden on the patient. So doing more services in a single visit and providing, for instance, 3 months of medicines instead of 1 month of medicines when someone needs to have a statin or other medicines for their condition, so they don't have to keep coming back. That might raise the per visit cost, but it lowers the overall cost and increases the effective management, effective control of these conditions. And then the third thing I want to mention, again, picking up on one of Dr. Angela's points, is the digital health, the e-health tools. Again, during COVID, there's been so much more experience with digital tools and telehealth. And for NCDs, again, that continuity of care can be done using those tools. And we have an example from Lebanon, for instance, where they have implemented an electronic data system using e-health tools, and they are able to provide health diet counseling, so healthy eating counseling to 77% of the patients compared to 8%. Where you don't have that digital tool for the providers to use to remind them and to serve as a decision support system. So I want to mention one other example of a public-private partnership that is developing this kind of digital tool, and that's the digital compass, the diabetes compass, being developed by the World Diabetes Foundation with support from Novo Nordisk and Novo Nordisk Foundation, where they're going to be customizing for the healthcare workers the digital tools that they can then use as they interact with patients. All of that provides greater access at lower cost and more effective management over time. So I'm really quite excited about those possibilities. Over.
Thank you, Rachel. Really interesting examples of what we can do and additional models of care. So we have just a few minutes left. So we're going to take a lightning round approach. Can each of you share in just a few words one thing that we can all do differently to deliver positive health impact related to NCDs and to scale up what works, especially in context of COVID and the pandemic? Let's start with you, Gloria.
I think that if partner countries are to sustainably achieve their development and humanitarian goals and scale it up, we should focus on enhancing their capacity and commitment to plan and implement local solutions to their development challenges.
Thank you. Rachel.
Yes, very briefly, being able to better integrate chronic care, NCDs, into primary health care. As I mentioned, there are many ways, task shifting and changing the need for specialists and using electronic systems, digital systems. We can integrate our primary health care to cover the overall needs, the full health needs of patients, including NCDs. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Angela.
Echoing Gloria and Rachel as well. Strengthening healthcare systems, especially primary healthcare systems, will be key. A rising tide rises all boats. And as we strengthen health systems to manage COVID-19, we will also strengthen health systems to manage non-communicable diseases. And that includes investing in community health workers, investing in digital health, as well as investing in the primary healthcare infrastructure in marginalized, vulnerable communities.
That was a great summary, Dr. Angela. I'd like to wrap up today by first thanking our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully, you all have enjoyed the discussion and found it interesting and illuminating. I know we've just scratched the surface here, but hopefully we've provided some insights on how we can better meet the health needs of our most vulnerable communities. And finally, I'd just like to thank the Chamber for hosting this and having us today. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning to some of you, depending on where in the world you are. These virtual events. My name is Justin Knight, and I serve as Director of the Office of External Affairs here at FEMA, and I'm so thrilled to be moderating today's panel. Our very quick discussion today aims to highlight the best practices and real-world examples of equity in action. Through the experience of and leadership of our panelists, we will explore the work of advancing. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning to some of you, depending on where. Okay, a little technical difficulty there. Real-world examples of equity in action through our leaders of the panel. We'll explore how they've been able to advance equity in their organizations, not only in the recovery phase, but the full life cycle of a disaster. As we together build a more disaster resilient nation, equity is more than just a word that's being used a lot right now, right? We're hearing the word a lot, buzzword, as our administrator says, but it's more than that, as Administrator Chris Grell also says, that equity is actually a call to action to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of our disaster preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. This is especially true for communities that I say are often those that have been shut out, put out, or forgotten. So with that, let's meet our panel. These three thought leaders will share with us today some of the best practices and perspectives that will help all of us think a little differently and more effectively of how we advance equity. First, we have Dr. Nicolette Louis-Saint, who serves as Executive Director and President of the Healthcare Ready, a 501c3 organization that focuses on strengthening the United States' healthcare supply chain preparedness response before, during, and after natural disasters and pandemics. Next, please meet Dr. Sylvia Bartley. Dr. Bartley is a lifelong seeker of spiritual enlightenment and inner peace. I love that. She strives to hold these values in all aspects of her life, both as a senior global director of Medtronic and in her community service work to help eliminate economic, health, and educational disparities in Minnesota. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Mr. Brooks Nelson, who is the Senior Manager for Community Resilience at Walmart.org, where he leads philanthropic disaster preparedness and response, working with partner nonprofits, operators, associates, as well as Walmart's international markets and customers. We don't have a lot of time today, so we've captured questions that gives our panelists the ability to speak to their experiences and shine a light on perspectives that will help all of us, again, advance this work. And so my first question, of which I'm going to ask all of our panelists to give 2-minute remarks, please ground us in your experience. How are you currently working to build resilience as leaders in your organizations? And Dr. Louis-Saint, please kick us off.
Sure. And I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you for having such an important conversation. We'll do my best in 2 minutes. So building resilience in our organization, really interesting that you asked that at this juncture, because if you think about where we are a year and a half into the COVID response, I think, resilience can mean a lot of things, but first and foremost, what it means for me is making sure that I'm taking care of our organization in ways that allow for us to take care of our people, allow for them to be able to be resilient in the ways that, frankly, they should not have to be, but they have to be at this juncture because of how hard they've worked over the last year and a half, which also means their ability to only fulfill their mission if they can fulfill their ability to take care of themselves and their families first and foremost. So that is paramount to me in building resilience, is that our mission really depends on the shoulders, the minds, the hearts of the people who are in the organization and have to carry that out and can only do so when they're taken care of. I think beyond that, what it also means for us is that we have to look at the communities and the populations that we serve from a value-based perspective, understanding that they have inherently within them knowledge, capacity, ideas, energy that we need to make sure that we are incorporating into strategies that will help them absorb shocks and recover from stresses, and not viewing them from a deficit model, which would suggest that we need to parachute in, provide them with things, and then step away, which is not resilient or sustainable from our approach.
No, I'm totally tracking with that, and thank you for those remarks. Dr. Bartley, let's go to you next.
Yeah, and thank you very much for this opportunity to be on this panel as well. And I will follow Nicolette and say the same. I work for Medtronic, a medical device company, and our mission is really focused on alleviating pain, restoring health, and extending life. And through our work, we treat over 70 conditions in the human body, and our therapies really do address these chronic conditions. And we're a true global company operating in over 150 countries. So when I think about resilience from the Medtronic PLC side, we really do focus, just like Nicolette says, on employees first, making sure they have what they need to do to be whole, to be safe, and to really work and be able to live their lives the best that they can. And part of that, of course, is ensuring that they are able and well positioned to help our communities as well as our patients. And of course, we put our patients front and center of everything that we do. And because we are dealing with patients with chronic illnesses, we've got to make sure that they have what they need to survive during normal, in parentheses, conditions, as well as conditions after a disaster. In the Medtronic Foundation, where I work, overseeing our employee engagement, and also overseeing how we respond to disaster response, we work with our strategic thought partners internally and externally to develop a really robust framework on how we prepare communities for disasters and how we can respond as quickly as we can to impacted communities after a disaster has occurred. And part of our resilience plan is to really leverage one of our most precious treasures in Medtronic, which is our employees. And we work with nonprofit organizations to curate volunteer programs so that our employees can hit the ground at the appropriate time after a disaster, such as Hurricane Maria and Harvey, and work on a very, in a very processed way to really help build and strengthen communities and healthcare centers. And our plan is not just in the relief, it's also in the long-term recovery as well. So we're very invested in helping the relief and building resilience, particularly in healthcare systems around the world.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. And with that, Mr. Nelson, over to you.
Sure, thank you so much. So over the years, Walmart has been intentional about leveraging our strengths and associates and other resources to help support and build resiliency in communities. And while Walmart has always helped communities in times of disaster, the experience of Hurricane Katrina helped us realize how we can best draw on our strengths to support relief efforts in the aftermath of disaster. And similar to my fellow panelists, we really focus on our associates first, our store operations, so that the community can get in and get the supplies they need, and then supporting the community. And our philanthropy has evolved since Katrina and aims to improve the entire systems, not just respond in the moment. So as such, we focus on both disaster response and disaster preparedness efforts. We take a shared value approach and look for opportunities where our investments, operations, and in-kind support can unlock barriers and open up possibilities for further capacity building. So since 2016, Walmart, Sam's Club, and the Walmart Foundation has provided more than $108 million in cash and in-kind donations to support the community preparedness and relief efforts for disasters. So two examples I just want to highlight of these recent investments, especially supporting equity in disaster response, was through support to two existing grantees. Recognizing the need to recruit and create more culturally diverse community response teams to better serve and engage underserved communities, the Walmart Foundation supported the Salvation Army to partner with IDIM to develop a new training curriculum for existing volunteers, as well as train leadership staff to create an equity-based program for recruitment of new volunteers and individuals. Additionally, the Walmart Foundation recently invested in new programs like support through SVP's Leadership Practitioner Training Program, which helps build resilient communities through training state and local government leaders and practitioners whose job it is to ensure federal funds reach the most vulnerable people in a timely manner. This training not only helps practitioners identify underrepresented communities who need the funding the most, but also helps increase the speed at which these funds are allocated. So these investments, among many other of our support, is just continued effort to help communities build resiliency and respond more effectively and equitably when disaster strikes.
Thank you so much for that. And as we think about all of our organizations, the roles that we play in the community within such important work, we also have responsibility to those communities that, as I said before, those often shut out, put out, and forgotten. And so as we think about equity specifically, and most of you connected to that in your remarks about how you're advancing this idea of resilience in our nation and with our communities and with our organizations, wanting to drill down specifically in today's topic, which is equity. And I have a two-part question for you. The first part is, how are you using equity as a lens to advance change in your organizations? So what does that equity piece look like? And the second part of that question is, what are the barriers you're experiencing? I think sometimes we try to just oversell the wins and the successes without specifically talking about the barriers, because that's where the true change happens. If equity was something that was easy, we wouldn't be talking about it right now in 2021. So I'd love to hear, again, the lens in which you're using equity and the barriers that you're experiencing and how you're addressing that work. And let's go back the opposite way to be equitable in our remarks. Mr. Nelson, let's start with you.
All right. So, I mean, we work toward advancing diversity, equity, inclusion across all of our giving portfolios. We aim to advance solutions to bridge divides and help work toward a world in which all people have equitable access to tools. And that remains especially true as we respond to disaster and consider our investments for preparedness. We look at vulnerabilities within the community. We look at the access to services. We look at socioeconomic factors, and then we also ensure racial equity as we're thinking about the lenses from our framework. Like many of the companies and partners on today's conference, we've been very engaged in the response to India's recent COVID surge through donations of oxygen plants, cylinders, containers, concentrators. And so using that equity lens, we worked very closely with our partners, AmeriCares and International Medical Corps with Doctors for You, to ensure that where those supplies were being placed were being done in an equitable way, and really thinking about rural populations and health disparities and where we were in the hospitals that we were selecting for that. So to be able to apply that, we rely very heavily on our local markets and our local partners. That information is extremely helpful, but it can be a barrier in the speed of the information that's provided as we're trying to make decisions very quickly. And then another barrier is knowing who the local partners are and who are meeting those needs of the communities and reaching the people that we're trying to serve.
I appreciate that. Let's go over to Dr. Bartley.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to talk from the Medtronic Foundation perspective. In Medtronic PLC, we have a very deep and impactful diversity, equity, inclusion strategy that we've been working on for many years, and it's come to fruition, particularly with the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And that really is becoming embedded in the fabric of the organization and how we work. Now, when it comes to the foundation, we are also applying that equitable lens in the way that we do our business. And so if I focus just on disaster response, as you know, disasters exacerbate wealth inequalities, and there is a national research study to provide data to support that. And we know the economic burden of the pandemic and the rude awakening of the racial inequities triggered by the public lynching of George Floyd. Equity, and particularly racial equity, is at the forefront of most business strategies. And when I was preparing for this talk, I read a McKinsey article that noted over $2 billion have been committed to addressing racial equity, and how these commitments will contribute to systemic change that's required to eliminate the inequities. That is yet to be demonstrated. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And so in the foundation, we are really applying our equitable lens to make sure that our partners who we do business with, that we have at least 50% of our nonprofit partners are diverse. And by diverse, I mean we're looking at the board level for diversity representation, at the senior leadership level in the organization, together with the communities that they serve. And then we really want to focus on lifting up and serving those most vulnerable, underserved populations throughout and after disaster and in all of our programming. And we're working with really good nonprofit partners and selecting them in a very inclusive way. And what we're doing that is very new since all of this change over the last 18 months or so is really involving employees in our partner selection, bringing their lens and their experiences and know-how into the process to make sure that we are considering all the organizations, because we don't know everyone that's out there, but considering all the organizations, particularly the diverse ones, and working very closely with our networks and our ERGs to make sure that we got the right representation and working with the right organizations. And that's been a big shift in how we select our partners and working very more closely with the ERGs in how we execute. Now, when it comes to the barriers, and yesterday we had a pre-session to talk about this with peers in the industry, I think the barriers are quite common across the industry. When we talk about working with diverse partners, you hear, this is a new space. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. Do they have the capability? Do they have the capacity? Do they have the reach? Do they have the scalability that we would want to have with a strategic partner, particularly when it comes to disaster response? And so, and companies like working with their existing partners because they've built trusting relationships, and that's very understandable. But the smaller organizations, which typically tend to be the diverse organizations, they're not even considered sometimes. And this is the barrier that we really have to address if we want to move the needle. Because as Nicolette says, we don't want to start this from a place of deficit. We want to start it from an asset base. These communities have lots of information, lots of treasures, lots of skills, lots of knowledge. They just need the agency to do what they know they need to do for their community. So we should partner with them from the very beginning and really help deliver our strategies and our focus on helping to eliminate disparities, particularly when it comes to disaster response. And I think that's our biggest challenge, really working outside of our comfort zone and just doing the work that it will take to work with these organizations and help them build capacity and do what they need to do to work in their communities.
So fantastic. And finally, let's go over to Dr. Lewison.
Sure. So I think on the equity lens, I would echo so much of what was already said, but I think for us, we look at it both internally as well as in the work that we do. And I think so much of the lens also exposes the barriers. So we look at it from the vantage point of what does it look like to have an equitable and a diverse team? What does it look like to view equity, diversity, and inclusion as a continuum, which means that our job is not done just because we're diverse, but we actually have to maintain an inclusive environment. How do you carry that out in your work? How do you carry that out in your salaries? How do you carry that out in how HR rolls out? How do you carry that out in your programs? And so when you start to think about the programs, if you look at the traditional emergency management life cycle, it actually gets really tricky for us as a nonprofit organization, if I'm being honest, because it's difficult to fund equitable work in preparedness. It's difficult to fund equitable recovery. And so when we are often thinking through how to maintain equity in all of the work that we do, sustainability and funding is actually a very big challenge. And I'm actually really proud of the ways in which our funders and partners have leaned in and have understood that it takes different sets of metrics. Sometimes you're planting the seeds and generations later, we will be able to enjoy the shade. But we do have to understand this idea of the investment is different. If we're really talking about resilience, it means that equity has to be in every stage of the programs that we do. And oftentimes we're struggling with how do you make a cleaner tie between community level investments in mitigation and preparedness, investments that may happen to absorb shocks and stressors in response, and then thinking through recovery in an equitable way. And I think often recovery is the part that is forgotten.
All those remarks and that perspective, I was writing notes as quickly as you guys were talking to try to capture all that thinking. And want to ask one more question before we go into our close. Our administrator Chris Wells, is very focused on this idea of the full scope, the full system of emergency management. And that definitely includes our faith-based leaders, community-based organizations, and as well as our nonprofit and corporate partners. And so in thinking about the role that you all play in a disaster before, during, and after, and to all those listening and watching this panel right now, what are some suggestions that you would offer for those that maybe haven't grappled with equity before? Whether it's data, whether it's making sure the workforce understands the definition of equity, whatever that is, just a couple of perspectives would be great. And let's keep the remarks to a minute. We're getting short on time. And to kick us off, we're going to go with Dr. Bartley.
Thank you. I hope you can't hear the storm here. The slides have just opened up, so excuse the noise. But I would say this, look, I think we've got to work differently. One thing COVID has taught us is how to reimagine how we work and how to reach people that we don't typically reach. And so when it comes to diversity, particularly in disaster response, I would just encourage everyone, one, to collect data on who are they funding and where is this money going, and collect that racial data as well to see which communities you're impacting, because we are lacking data in that space. Then secondly, work with different organizations that are community-based, that are rooted in the communities that are most vulnerable and that are most impacted by the barriers that we just spoke about earlier. And find them, work with FEMA. They're doing civil, I think it's called civil rights summits, where they're bringing these communities together so we can listen and learn, and then introduce them to organizations that are looking for partners like them. So do things like that that are very different and really work to get to those communities. Secondly, work with your existing partners, and if you're not already, directed with them, tell them, we would like to work in this population, in this region, and put some metrics down in the grant agreement before you enter into doing work with them, before you distribute grants. So it's very clear on both sides. And we do this in Medtronic, and our partners are more than happy to work with us and provide us with that information. So we're leading with impact, and we're being very directive as much as we can on the communities that we serve. And I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nelson. Over to you.
Well, just given time, I think Dr. Bartley summed that up perfectly well. Much of what I was going to say was very similar. Work with existing partners, but look for new partners, and just think about how unlocking additional financial resources for some of these underserved communities who may not have access to those is also critical.
And being mindful of time, we have just a minute left. So I'm going to ask Dr. Louisant to close us out with a call to action for the group and how we can think about what to do next.
Thank you. And again, thank you. So I would just say in 50 seconds or less that we have seen due to COVID that when we think about vulnerability, when we think about the ways in which disasters or catastrophic events can impact us, we should recognize that that actually means all of us. So when we're thinking about equity, it is not about us versus them. It's not a zero-sum game. It really is about how we consider the ways that we all tie in, and that we can lock hands and understand that every part of our society and all of the strategies that we roll out will have to be equitable if we are going to make it through this generation and all of the challenges that we think are going to face us in the near future. And so from my vantage point, I think there's an opportunity, but we should be thinking about this as a beginning and not an endpoint. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for this conversation. The time we had wasn't nearly enough to navigate the complexities and the critical urgency around equity, but the words and the pearls of wisdom you gave us today put us off into a really good path forward. So thank you for your brilliance, your minds, and your passion.
Yeah.
And thank you, Justin, for moderating that session. And Nicolette, you are so right. We are all in this together. And we apologize for the technical difficulties earlier. What we wanted to do is bring you back to the Deputy Secretary of HUD, Adrienne Tolman. She is live with us. I also wanted to just close out the thought before the last panel on the Coalition to Back Black Businesses. The reason I brought it up is because we need to also always consider economic resilience, particularly of our most vulnerable populations. So you can learn more about the coalition at webackblackbusinesses.com. So please check that out. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand it off to Deputy Secretary Toll.
Thank you. My thanks to the U.S. Commerce Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and U.S. Northern Command for inviting me to this wonderful event. Thank you as well to all the distinguished speakers who are sharing their insights today. Most importantly, thank you to our philanthropic partners and community leaders for your tireless work to build a more resilient, equitable future for all. We all know it has been an incredibly difficult year and a half, especially for those who were hit hardest by the pandemic and the economic downturn it caused. COVID-19 has exposed and deepened long-standing inequities in America. Inequities in who has access to affordable housing and good jobs. Inequities in who bears the brunt of a public health crisis and the financial insecurity it caused. And let me just share this point with you. If anyone in your community is struggling to meet their housing needs, please encourage them to visit HUD.gov for resources that can help them find housing and rental assistance. As America continues to rebuild from the immediate challenges posed by COVID-19, we must also take action to address the long-term dangers posed by climate change. We know climate change impacts all of us, and it disproportionately harms those Americans who already suffer the burdens of systemic racism and residential segregation. Formerly red-line neighborhoods often have fewer trees and more pavement, leaving them hotter and more likely to flood. And things can only get worse. In 2000, annual coast floods threatened nearly 8,000 affordable homes in the United States. By 2050, this number could rise by 25,000. And damages from extreme weather events have been shown to increase wealth inequality in our country. We must ensure disaster relief helps families of modest means. If America wants to build a more equitable and resilient future, we must increase our investments in marginalized communities. This is why HUD is working hard to elevate equity in all of our processes, from start to finish. Our community development block grants for disaster recovery are a great example of these efforts. We are now prioritizing engagement with local leaders and advocates when planning and implementing our resilience projects, with an emphasis on listening to the voices of people of color and other underserved groups. Grantees must assess how planning decisions affect members of protected classes, racially and ethnically concentrated areas, and areas of concentrated poverty. Grantees must also provide accessible engagement for all stakeholders by convening public hearings and allowing comments on proposed activities. HUD is also working to identify barriers to recovery and resilience, which can be different across groups. We require grantees to partner with communities to collect data on the racial, ethnic, and gender identities of the people they serve, and to use this data to determine if any inequities exist. To assist in this work, HUD is creating a citizen participation and community engagement toolkit to provide best practices and advice on how to meaningfully address the concerns of residents throughout the life of our grants. We hope to have it ready by this November. We can already see the impact of our work in places like Birmingham, Alabama. In 2011, a tornado leveled much of Pratt City, a largely Black suburb of Birmingham. The disaster displaced more than 1,000 residents. In the tornado's aftermath, the city of Birmingham partnered with AIA to create a community-driven recovery and revitalization strategy. Pratt City used nearly $18 million in HUD funding to build 4 neighborhood storm shelters, a 6-acre park, and a new community space with storm strength glass. The city also invested in housing reconstruction and senior housing development. HUD, in partnership with a broad coalition of local leaders, helped physically transform Pratt City. We helped boost civic pride, and we helped forge a more resilient community. A similar story is taking place in Iowa. After a series of floods devastated the state between 2011 and 2013, HUD is helping to repair more than 300 damaged homes in the city of Dubuque and making them more resilient going forward. HUD is also helping to build 9 watersheds all across Iowa. These infrastructure projects will help sustain the state's agricultural economy while protecting vulnerable groups who live downstream from farmlands. At HUD, we also understand we can't just help communities rebuild in the wake of disasters. We need to take bold, proactive action to protect them before such events ever take place. That is why we require the more than 1,200 grantees who receive our CDBG funding to consider resilience to national hazards in their consolidated plans to us. Our rule mandates that jurisdictions evaluate the risk posed by natural hazards to low and moderate income people, including housing risks that are expected to increase as a result of climate change. As we encourage our grantees to incorporate climate adaptation and mitigation into their core planning to help address environmental injustice. HUD is also building our library of climate resources to better support the communities we serve. In fact, we released a toolkit to help governments, stakeholders, and residents learn about these actions that they can take to defend themselves against natural hazards like heat, wildfires, droughts, and floods. Every day, these efforts are helping to create stronger, more resilient communities all across our country. And I'm glad to say that President Biden understands the importance of achieving this mission. You can see the president's commitment in his Build Back Better agenda. It contains historic investments that would increase America's climate resiliency by making our homes more energy efficient. And it would help build more sustainable infrastructure in historically underserved areas in big cities, rural communities, and tribal nations. HUD and the entire Biden-Harris administration understands that every segment of our society, from the government to business to the nonprofit sector, has an important role to play in the resilient space. In fact, we were the first federal agency to create an office solely dedicated to engaging with philanthropy, focused on building strategic partnerships to help us better serve communities. We are very proud of the work that we've accomplished here. This includes the Rebuild by Design competition, which HUD launched with the Rockefeller Foundation. Together, we helped communities throughout the Northeast make huge strides in recovering from the devastation caused by Hurricane Sandy. Moving forward, the importance of building public-private partnerships can only become more urgent. Our nation needs new ideas to navigate the challenges posed by the pandemic and by climate change. We need new approaches to ensure that all Americans, and especially the most vulnerable among us, are prioritized in our recovery efforts and our long-term resilience planning. HUD knows that in many ways, philanthropy and your grantees serve as early responders to the issues confronting your communities. We recognize your vital role as bridge builders, as innovators, as thought partners, as conveners, and really so much more. The Biden-Harris administration is thrilled to partner with you to help uplift big cities, small towns, and rural and tribal communities in every corner of this country. We look forward to continuing to work with all of you to help forge a more resilient, more equitable, and a more prosperous future. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting HUD to this event.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Todman. It's clear that HUD is such an important partner as we build resilience into this country. And thank all of the panelists for their insights and incredible efforts to deliver solutions to these unprecedented challenges. Tomorrow, we'll look at the next decade and beyond, from climate to supply chain resiliency to disaster response as it continues in the pandemic environment. We'll hear from White House National Security Council's Caitlin Durkovich, DHS Secretary Mayorkas, and President of the UPS Foundation, Nikki Clifton, and so many more great speakers. You won't want to miss it. We'll be right back here starting at 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. Thanks again for joining us today.
you.